on Public Safety. It is Tuesday, June 23rd, 2020. And I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health crisis, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft's Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how to publicly view and offer public testimony at these hearings of City Council committees are included in the hearing notices that are made public in the Daily News, the Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on the philacouncil.com. Now that the hour has come, Ms. Williams, will you please call the roll and make sure that all members are in attendance, and when your name is called, would you please say a few words so that your image will be placed on the television and monitor screens?
Councilmember Johnson? Councilmember Johnson?
Here.
Councilmember Thomas?
Present. I'm here.
Councilmember Green?
Present and here for hopefully a great hearing.
Councilmember Gautier?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Samantha, everyone. Happy to be here today for this important discussion.
Councilmember Gim? Councilmember Brooks?
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Councilman Jones, that completes the roll.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. That shows that a quorum is present and the hearing is now called to order. This is a public hearing of the Committee of Public Safety, and it's regarding bills number 200364 and bill number 200368. Ms. Williams, will you please read the titles of the bills?
Bill number 200364, an ordinance amending Title 17 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Contracts and Procurement by adding a new chapter 17-2300 entitled Public Hearing Required prior to the execution of a labor agreement with city workers represented by the Fraternal Order of Police with respect to the workers' terms and conditions of employment by establishing certain definitions and requiring a public hearing within 30 days prior to the city entering into or amending a labor agreement with city workers represented by the Fraternal Order of Police, all under certain terms and conditions. And bill number 200368, an ordinance amending Title 10 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Regulation of Individual Conduct and Activity by adding a new chapter 10-2500 entitled Prohibited Physical Contact by Peace Officers to prevent unnecessary death or injury via asphyxiation by prohibiting certain physical contact by peace officers, all under certain terms and conditions.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Before I begin to allow testimony from the witnesses here today, everyone who has been invited to this meeting to do testimony should be aware that this is a public hearing, and it is being recorded. Because of the fact that it is a public hearing, there is no expectation of privacy once you begin your testimony. And by continuing to engage in this meeting, you are giving your consent for you to be recorded. Additionally, prior to the recognizing of members for questions and comments, we will be using the chat feature in Microsoft Teams to be acknowledged. Because that is also subject to the sunshine laws, that will be the only purpose of the chat feature. And with that, we can begin our hearing. All right, so will the bill sponsors, I can stop the script now. Will the bill sponsors like to give some comment about their legislation? And I'll begin with Member Gilmore Richardson.
Yes, thank you so much, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilmember Jones, and all the members of the Public Safety Committee for holding this hearing today on these two very important pieces of legislation. And thank you to all of my colleagues who are on the committee who co-sponsor the legislation that I introduced, Bill number 200364. Our city has risen up over the past few weeks to demand change. Our constituents have made their voices heard, and that engagement is what has made this moment so powerful. I know a number of my colleagues have received almost 30,000 emails from members of the public calling for more transparency and accountability to the police department. And these calls cannot be ignored. Mr. Chair, for the record, it's important for me to note that we were transparent and inclusive even prior to introducing the legislation. We contacted stakeholders on all sides, multiple times, and some every day, to ensure that we were able to have important conversations, whether we agreed or disagreed. And based on a number of those meetings held with a variety of stakeholders and the administration, namely the Mayor's Office of Labor, and I want to send a special shout out to the Mayor's Office of Labor for all the work that we've been doing day in and day out, the Fraternal Order of Police, and many community members, we have amended the bill to require that the public hearing take place 30 days prior to the administration submitting its proposal, rather than 30 days prior to the finalization of the contract. At that point in the process, the administration is no longer able to modify the contract because of Act 111 binding arbitration. The purpose of this amendment is to allow the administration time to make changes to the proposal based on the public input received at the City Council public hearing. Mr. Chair, it's important to underscore that this legislation is not meant to weaken the collective bargaining process or do anything to take away from the important protections unions offer to workers. It does not affect any labor union besides the Fraternal Order of Police. It is meant to offer an opportunity for the public to share their ideas, concerns, and questions on the administration's initial proposal to the police union. Nothing in this bill would interfere with the arbitration process between the police union and the city, as the amendments we've offered will require the hearing to take place before the negotiation. Or if necessary, arbitration process begins, and for the administration to provide an update to the council president on how public input influenced their submission to the police officers union. And in response to the letter written by Council Member Johnson that was co-signed by a majority of our colleagues, Mayor Kinney noted his support for this specific proposal. Transparency and accountability are crucial. They're crucial to creating trust between the public and government. We cannot create change behind closed doors. We must respond to our constituent calls to have more input on spending. The most recent extension to the FOP contract was submitted without public comment or input from the people we serve. At a time when revenues were expected to drop rapidly, we knew many painful cuts to personnel and services would result. However, because there was no opportunity to express input, the extension to the FOP contract commenced. If the public had been provided with an opportunity to comment, we likely would have heard from them earlier about investing more in social services and arts and culture and helping us to avoid many of the painful cuts that were proposed. We must also shed light on the practices and procedures that have allowed structural racism to continue to thrive in our country. In an article in yesterday's Inquirer, they detailed how the PPD continues to suffer from systematic racism and structural oppression. The examples range from the overwhelming number of white officers, 6 in 10 overall, in a city that is only 35% white, to alleged instances of retaliation towards officers of color who have spoken out against racism and sexist practices. One of the most striking facts to me, considering our homicide rate, was that 73% of detectives are white. Only 20% of detectives are Black. This was the widest gap of all the positions listed. When last year, 85% of homicide victims were Black. Are we really equipping our departments with the skills and the cultural competencies and connections they need to do their jobs? Are we serving our neighborhoods in the best way we can in this current state? And Mr. Chair, to finish up, I'm very, very clear. This bill will not eradicate structural inequities, but it will set us on a path towards change. For too long, these contract negotiations have been used to prop up policies and procedures that have maintained the status quo, especially when it comes to internal disciplinary procedures. With the voice of the people as a part of the conversation, we will be able to hold ourselves and our police department accountable. We will be more responsible in how we spend valuable and limited taxpayer dollars, and we will be better able to support the people who vow to serve and protect us. These reforms are not aimed at placing blame or pointing fingers. I am genuinely grateful to the police officers who serve our city, especially the officers of color who feel stuck between their commitment to public service and their communities. I truly, truly get it. But what we do know is that this system is not working. And the reforms we are proposing are recognition that for far too long, our present has been dictated by our past. I proposed this bill and supported the other proposals from my colleagues because we are ready to find a new normal. And again, I am grateful to the work of the Police Reform Policy Group and our council leadership and all the stakeholders who have engaged with us to get here. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that latitude. Thank you so much.
Member Gilmore Richardson, we want to thank you for your input to the conversation. You didn't start the conversation, but for sure, your voice is being heard today. Member Johnson, would you like to have a moment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Those were the last final words of George Floyd on May the 25th in Minneapolis. The bill I'm putting forward today focuses on prohibiting of tactics by law enforcement and peace officers that goes toward the asphyxiation of an individual when they lose their breath, primarily around tactics that result in a chokehold. Most of you may or may not know that chokeholds primarily right now are prohibited as a result of the Philadelphia Police Department policy. But my particular bill that I'm putting forward actually prohibits specifically tactics such as using a knee on an individual's neck, head, chest, or back as a way to detain them that can result in the loss of breath, which also can result in a loss of life. I want to take a moment to thank Commissioner Danielle Outlaw for having an understanding and working in partnership with my office around this particular legislation and the amendment that goes toward actually clarifying when these types of tactics are specifically prohibited. I want to also thank our sheriff, Rochelle Bilal, who will also be providing testimony in support of this legislation. I also want to thank Chief Nessel of Scepter Police for also providing testimony, because at the end of the day, and most of you already know, myself being a chairman of the Special Committee on Gun Violence, I've worked hand in hand for over the last 20 years as a community activist and as a state representative and a council person around the issue of getting guns off the street, around the issue of building the partnership between the community and our law enforcement community. But most importantly, we want to make sure that the public has a sense of trust. And I believe that this bill goes forward to making sure that we can still have public safety, but also making sure that our officers are doing their work with fidelity when it comes to apprehending individuals. We do not need a George Floyd incident to take place here in the city of Philadelphia in order for us to be reactionary and then introduce legislation, but we want to be proactive in this process. And so I want to thank the working group that's headed up by members of the Philadelphia delegation and also members of City Council. And also I want to thank my chairman of Public Safety, Councilman Curtis Jones, for his encouragement, his support, and his feedback around this particular legislation. And thank you very much for the opportunity to provide comment for the record.
Thank you, Member Johnson. I just want you to know that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is reviewing all of the legislation that is being put forth by Philadelphia and looking at its relevance throughout the Commonwealth and every aspect in every county, and using that possibly as a model to encourage local municipalities to take a page from our book to make sure that there is some degree of uniformity throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So you guys are setting a tone that may, dare I say, be national, may well be national. So with that, Ms. Williams, are you ready to read the names of the first panel to testify?
Yes. The first panel to testify will be Rich Laser and City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt.
Well, this is very different, Deputy Mayor Laser, to welcome you to a virtual hearing.
Oh.
But please,
glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. You know how it goes. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Jones and members of the committee. My name is Richard Laser. I'm Deputy Mayor for Labor, and I appear before you to testify on Bill number 200364. I'm also joined with Monica Marchetti-Brock, Director of Labor Relations, whose office oversees negotiations, and she's here as well to answer any questions that may arise after my testimony. We're all aware of the national and local events which helped form this bill, starting with the murder of George Floyd on May 25th of this year. The civil unrest that followed this murder and the murder of far too many black men and women has once again brought attention to the systematic and institutionalized racism that plagues our society. An area that needs immediate attention in light of this crisis is repairing the broken trust between public servants, specifically police, and the people they serve. One way we can address this is through having more public feedback and attention to labor negotiations and Act 111 arbitration between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police. As part of an overall police reform package, Mayor Kenney committed to a number of important steps to increase transparency and accountability, including a public hearing before the city enters into an agreement with the FOP. This reform is legislated through Bill number 200364. The administration is committed to council and community input when it comes to the FOP contract, including the public forum where city residents can openly speak. We believe the most appropriate part of the bargaining process for this hearing to take place would be prior to the submission of the city's initial bargaining proposals, when the administration still has the flexibility to add or to revise our proposals, and before the negotiations binding arbitration under Act 111. This bill, with the proposed amendments, accomplishes just that. It provides the public forum that will facilitate transparency and public comment while preserving our right to collectively bargain with represented city employees. I'd like to thank Councilperson Gilmer Richardson for sponsoring this bill and for our co-sponsors for their efforts to be partners with the administration in advancing this valuable legislation. The administration strongly supports this bill and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have at this time. Thank you.
If the committee will indulge me, I'd like to allow the controller to give her testimony before we go in on any questions on bill number 200364. Thank you, Controller Reinhardt.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, Councilman Jones, Chairman Jones, and the members of the Committee on Public Safety. Today, I'm testifying in favor of bill number 200364. First, I would like to thank Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson for her advocacy on this bill and recognize the members who co-signed onto it. I would also like to recognize Council for putting forward reforms to public safety in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. Bill number 200364 is an important step in increasing transparency and public understanding of negotiations between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police. As outlined in the bill, the public hearing would include a representative from the administration to inform council and the public of the terms of the contract, including the cost of the contract and any other terms or conditions set forth. While contract negotiations can be very fluid up until the moment both sides agree to the terms, I do believe that the administration could meet the spirit of these requirements by reporting on the areas of discussion between the city and the union and major terms, including wage increases, health benefit changes, pension contributions, and the position of both the city and the union on each major term. Knowing the areas of discussion is important because often a change in one area may impact another. For example, if the administration pursues changing the residency requirement, they will likely need to offset that change with another area the union wants. Additionally, the administration will be able to provide costs related to both their stance and the union stance on each of the major terms. I support this bill because it represents an opportunity to holistically and transparently present contract information to the public who ultimately foot the bill. As stated in the bill, transparency in government is key to improving the public's trust in government to carry out the will and best interest of the public it serves. As I stated, I'm in favor of this legislation and do encourage you to consider extending it beyond the FOP to the other three unions, Firefighter Local 22, District Council 33, and DC 47. In the city's most recent contract negotiations with DC 33 and 47, the raises provided were retroactive to May 1st. Most Philadelphians were not aware that these one-year raises included 2 additional months of salary increases for the city's unions. And while I support the city's hardworking employees, every expense the city incurs during this budget and economic crisis needs to be carefully vetted. And I do want to add that transparency does not negatively impact or weaken collective bargaining, but transparency is vital to an informed public. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you both for your testimony. I guess I will start with just clarifying for those who may be listening or viewing this on public television that the Controller's Office does not typically sit in contract negotiations for any union, and in particular the police union. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely not. We are not. The controller, as a separately elected and financial watchdog, is not part of union negotiations.
And in that, you get the contract almost the same time as council and the general public get the final rendition of that contract. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And then you make a value kind of judgment on cost and impact of those conditions of that particular contract or labor agreement, correct?
Yes, the contract negotiation process is completely between the administration and the union.
So in your opinion, things like non-residency for members of the Philadelphia Police Department, has that had a financial impact in one way or another during the course of the previous contract?
I think that there are terms that have a clear financial impact. Residency doesn't necessarily have a clear financial impact, but it has an potential operations impact, I would say.
So what are some of the terms and conditions of the prior contract that strike you as being financially impactful? I'll put it that way.
The biggest financially impactful areas are wage increases, pension, and healthcare. And then there are smaller areas of cost, but then there are the items that might not have a clear cost, but they definitely have a value. So that could be the residency requirement or arbitration rules, for example.
So last year, or in the last 3 years, let's go with 3 years, has there been an impact on lawsuits that have been settled due to allegations of misconduct by members?
Yeah, I mean, the arbitration process as set forth does impact, what happens to employees and if they're kept or returned back to their job. But I can't comment on specific lawsuits and what that impact could be. But I do think that, arbitration rules do have an impact.
So one of the things, and I'm going to pass off to other members, and Ms. Williams, I'm going to need you to maintain the order of the questions that will be in the chat feature, and you'll let me know who's up next, please. But if someone was accused of wrongdoing, and then they were placed on leave while the arbitration and allegation is decided, and let's say that leave lasted a year, and then at the end of that arbitration, they received their job back pay, any promotions that they may have been entitled to, any overtime they may have been entitled to. Does that have a financial impact?
Well, yes, of course, that would have a financial impact.
Do you know what that impact has been in the last year?
No, I don't know that number.
All right. I'm going to move on. And Ms. Williams, who is first to ask questions among the membership?
Councilwoman Gaudier is first up.
Member Gaudier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Mayor Laser, for the benefit of the viewing public, can you please walk through the typical bargaining process between the city and the FOP as mandated by Act 111? For example, what is the timeline for negotiations? Who makes the initial proposal? When is that proposal made? How do negotiations end up leading to arbitration? And what does that arbitration decision mean for the city and its residents?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Again, this is Rich Laser, and Monica from my office is also on here. And Monica, if you have anything you want to add after I say something, please do, because you're closer to it. But usually we put our proposals together for the FOP, and we'll submit them December 31st to submit them over to the Fraternal Order of Police. Once they're submitted, we'll get theirs as well, and then there'll be, after we can start the negotiations at that point, or before then if we need to, but also 30 days after the submission, exchange of proposals, either side can declare an impasse. And when an impasse is declared, that's when the Act 111 arbitration process kicks in, and that where both sides can pick an arbitrator and then try to agree on a neutral arbitrator, and then submit issues and disputes to the panel. Monica, do you want to add?
Sure, Rich. So essentially, the end of a contract typically ties with the end of the fiscal year or the beginning of the new fiscal year. So all of our contracts for the last probably 20 plus years have expired on June 30th because the fiscal year starts on July 1st. So 6 months prior to the end of the fiscal year, which is the December 31st date that Rich mentioned, is the date that is essentially the final date that the parties exchange their issues in dispute, or their initial bargaining proposals, excuse me. Once there's an impasse, either party can declare impasse. Typically, the FOP declares impasse, and we'll send the city an email or a letter stating such, and also identifying who their party arbitrator will be. In turn, the city has a period of time to respond with our party arbitrator as well. And then hearings will begin. The Act 111 does designate a period of time, but typically the parties waive that in order to work with witnesses who have to provide different types of testimony for the Act 111 process.
Thank you. Can you talk about why the most recent police contract extension did not result in arbitration?
Yep. So we had all 4 bargaining units: District Council 33, District Council 47, Local 22, and the FOP were all up at the same time. All 4 agreements were running together. We had exchange proposals. We started the process. We were getting hearings scheduled for a multi-year deal. And then the pandemic had hit, and we thought it would be better to extend all 4 contracts with some type of increase in the wage for this year, instead of trying to lock into a multi-year deal when we really didn't know at that point how the economic forecast or the city's financials will be indexed. Because if we had entered an agreement for arbitration on both, it could have been at least a 3 or 4 year locked-in deal. The other, 33 and 47 do not have arbitration. We negotiate those contracts, but we were concerned, so that's why we did the extension for all 4 groups instead of full bar.
Thank you. Can you talk about the city's general process for coming up with its initial contract proposal for the FOP, and how the public comment facilitated by this bill might influence the city's initial proposal and positions during the negotiation process?
Sure. So usually with all 4 groups, we go to the specific departments that are affected, or the commissioners, and ask for different things that they may be looking for. And then specifically for the FOP, we work with the commissioner, work with the Department of Finance, work with my office to come up with issues that we feel are needed. This last round of negotiations that we started to enter into before we did the extension, we did hold stakeholder meetings with community members and different folks in the community to go over our requests, or what we had regarding residency, reforms to the discipline process, reforms to the scope of the arbitrator's authority, different things like that we were talking about. We did have multiple meetings before that. I think this is, in my opinion, and I think the administration's opinion is, I think, we all work in government. We do the best we can to try to serve the public, but I think it is important that we, and as I think the councilwoman said this, that we put forth what the proposals are that we feel are important, but I think it's good to hear from folks that in the public to come back to say, so they can have questions for why we are seeking certain things, and also what they may have experienced in their life, or what they think is important to them in their communities. And I think it's important for us to hear that. And then I think that'll help us change proposals that we may thought were finalized, but actually get the public's opinion on it. I think it's important, because I think that'll help change and shape proposals going forward.
Okay. Assuming that this bill is adopted, I presume you'll be the person testifying on behalf of the administration at a future public comment session required by the bill. Do you anticipate sharing the city's initial written contract proposal with City Council and members of the public prior to this public hearing?
Yeah, I think that would make a lot of sense. I know we've met with several members of the last round of negotiations, but I think it's important to have those proposals out there prior to the hearing, so that people have a chance to digest them and look at them before they can make comment on them.
Great. And do you anticipate discussing any provisions in the initial contract proposal, including the reasoning for proposing a specific provision?
Yes, I think that would be. I think it's a great idea, and I think it's important to do that.
Great. Thank you so much. No more questions.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson?
Okay, thank you so much, Sam, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to circle back to say thank you to the Mayor's Office of Labor and our Deputy Mayor, Rich Laser, and Monica Marchetti-Brock for working with us late into the evening on all of these amendments. And also wanted to thank our Controller, Rebecca Reinhardt, for your testimony. I wanted to circle back because my colleague, Councilmember Gaudier, already asked several of the questions that I had for your office, namely around the timeline of the negotiation process for the record, because I know that was a large part of the amendments that we had to offer for this process. But if you could just talk about briefly the last amendment that we offered around the feedback that the Mayor's Office of Labor will give to City Council relative to the changes you would make based on the input you received. And I know Member Gaudier brought this up, but I think it's
somebody from the Tribune trying to
how much we
set up something. Hello?
We worked on this amendment. So if you could just detail kind of that process of how your office will interface with City Council to notate the changes made based on the input received.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to do that. I think that's why we chose to work with you on the amendment to do 30 days prior to submission, so that we can show you where the administration's thoughts are on reforms and different changes, and then have the members of public comment. I think there will be changes that come out of that hearing. I think after we digest the discussion at the hearing, we then can make changes or tweaks to the proposal, because at that point it's still a living document. It's not something that's set in stone. So I think once we have that hearing, we can hear from members of the public, from stakeholders, from council members, and then we can also make changes to our proposals, and then we can report back to Council President so he can disseminate all that information to members on changes that were made due to the hearing.
Thank you so much. And to our controller, I just had a very quick question, because I think 9 times out of 10, and I know in a number of the communications I receive, we hear a lot about waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste, fraud, and abuse. How do you think this legislation and the provisions made will help with waste, fraud, and abuse as we look at the dollars we spend on public safety in our budget?
Well, I think transparency is always important to rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. I think that it's an interesting question. I think that the more transparent and the more input that people have, the less fraud and abuse there is. And I think that there should be scrutiny and more scrutiny on what the terms are of contracts and public opinion in on that. But, I don't think there's a direct correlation on this just because I don't think there's anything overly related to waste, fraud, or abuse specifically on this bill. But I do think that transparency overall is a really important part of accountability, and accountability prevents waste, fraud, and abuse.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Richardson. Can I ask this question? Can you provide, and this goes to our Deputy Mayor as well, a matrix that looks at the top 5 cities in America and their respective police departments, and do a comparison on what we spend on salaries, what we spend on health care, and those kinds of critical measurements that might be relevant as we can evaluate how we compare to others. I think that would be helpful for members and the public to be able to do a comparison. So most recently, our sister brother city of Camden has been touted as one of the best cities for community policing. That may be true, but we don't have comparisons, apples to apples comparison to judge it by. So if you guys could work on that, I think that might be helpful for all members of City Council and the public.
Yep. Chair Jones, I agree. We do that type of work for when we do arbitration, and we put on a presentation on where we rank among cities like ourselves. And Monica, if you want to, I know you have a little more information on it, but we do a comparison amongst other cities when it comes to salaries and different things like that.
Yes, Rich, that's correct. I mean, we tend to compare Philadelphia to cities like Philadelphia. Comparing salaries to a larger city like New York, we tend to fall short because we do not pay necessarily as much as maybe the New York Police Department. So we tend to do those comps. We can certainly get you information that we have that we started to work on prior to receiving the 1-year extension. And we can also give you an example of a previous presentation that was done comparing Philadelphia police to other municipalities and other police forces.
So cities like New York obviously is a bigger city with a larger force, but Chicago and other places that aren't big, but I'd love to see the apples to apples comparison on what we are offering as a municipality, and that might be good for recruitment to get people to be in the police force that reside in Philadelphia and be able to say, look, you can't find a better deal anywhere. Or maybe we need to take a look at what we are paying per police person.
Yeah,
right?
I know we do look at DC and we look at Baltimore as well. And I just like to say another comment too, like we're happy for members of the committee or members in general to sit down with anyone and go over our proposals from before, our presentations from for anything, any questions that come up, just reach out and we're happy to go through any information that you see fit that you need.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for these witnesses?
Councilmember Thomas.
Councilmember Thomas, are you there?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to my colleague, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson, for your leadership on this resolution. I think this is something that's very important. I'm glad we're starting the conversation right now, and I cannot wait to implement this process as long as we see fit for it to be done. Commissioner Laser, a quick question for you first. There have been some feedback that we've received that basically says that this open process will impact the city's ability to negotiate a fair contract for the best interests of the constituents. What would you say to critics who would be against this process because they feel like this process would impact your ability, the city's ability to essentially negotiate when it comes time for that process to essentially start?
No, and Councilman Gilmore Richardson, we had this conversation as well. I don't agree with that. I think it's important that we have this process, that we do a public hearing to show where our heads are on where we think are important reforms that we as the city feel. But I think as folks that work in government, it is good to reach out to constituents. At the end of the day, the public funds our salaries, funds the salaries of all city workers. I think it's important that we are transparent with them. And I don't think it does hurt the bargaining process at all. I think it's important that we put that out there, we put the information out there, we get feedback, and then there might be ideas and changes that come from that hearing that are important that we maybe have missed or didn't see that we can then add and then make our proposal stronger.
Thank you. Thank you for your support and thank you for your testimony today. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Thomas. Is there any other members that wish to question our witnesses? Ms. Williams?
There's no other members who, never mind.
I see
Member Johnson.
Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one real quick question for Richie. Richie, in the capacity of the negotiations with the FOP, what role is the city playing regarding Act 111 and issues regarding the disciplinary actions taken toward police officers?
So in our proposals that we have, and except Monica could jump in as well, in the proposals that we had submitted, we do recommend changes to the arbitration process in regards to discipline, and different ways that we feel that maybe the arbitrator has overstepped his or her boundaries, and maybe has, and we also had put information. I know another member had brought this up about back awards, back overtime, back pay, all that stuff. The arbitrator has very wide range of authority on, and I think a lot of our proposals try to change the process in whole, but also try to stop that back pay and also their authority to go outside of the different scope of the actual discipline. So I don't know if Monica, you want to add anything else, but I think it's important, and we are trying to reform that in our proposals.
Rich, I think you summed it up very well. I mean, ultimately, we had a proposal that we were willing to put forward to basically limit the arbitrator's authority as far as back pay, and to ultimately just have them decide whether or not what an officer did was in fact an infraction of the rule or regulation, and not to really amend the disciplinary action that was imposed by the department. We really did look at those proposals regarding disciplinary measures and had hoped to really move forward with those in this round, and I'm sure we'll move a little further in the next.
Okay. And I just wanted clarification for that, because I know there's a lot of issues that people are trying to address regarding police reform, but ultimately we're at the table right now as a result of officers' actions. I mean, at the end of the day. And so I know we could talk about overtime and things of that nature, but at the end of the day, we're talking about, how law enforcement officers, in this particular case, for our police department, interacts with the public. And we talk about building trust, we talk about building safety. It's only a win-win we have the type of reforms that address that issue when a person is disciplined totally for some type of action that was really unbecoming of wearing a badge, and then they get their jobs back, right?
Yep.
Then you have detectives who are out there doing the hard work of trying to solve homicides, and they need information from the public. But if we don't have faith in that system, we're definitely not going to come forward and provide information to help solve a homicide. And I think when you have incidents where an officer is fired, they lose their position, and then somehow they back on the force, they're promoted, it just breaks down that public trust between the community and members of the Philadelphia Police Department. So I wanted to get an understanding of our role when it comes to Act 111, because I know that plays a critical role in changing those dynamics. And then last, there's the myth, and you can clarify for me for the record, but there's a myth that the arbitrator that normally participates in these deals, right, are 9 times out of 10 more favorable to lean toward the FOP. And then there's a myth that there's a relationship, right? So explain real quick for the record, where do these arbitrators come from? Explain that process so the public can feel today that there's a neutral party that has no relationship with anyone at the table, and they're ruling just based upon how they're ruling, as opposed to them having some type of cozy relationship with a particular union, in this case, the FOP.
Monica, I don't know if you want to jump on that one.
Sure. So I think that myth is something that is from the past. Previously, the FOP utilized an arbitrator who had been around for a very, very long time, who probably had a lot of ties to other arbitrators within the AAA system. So we call the American Association of Arbitration AAA. That is who is designated as the entity that provides the arbitrators for the city. That's in the collective bargaining agreements. We pick arbitrators from a strike list, which is about 20 names off of the list. The list comes to us from AAA with arbitrators of different backgrounds. Unfortunately, the pool of arbitrators overall is probably not as diverse as it should be, typically because there aren't that many people in this field who go for the role of an arbitrator. Arbitrators can be previously attorneys or people frankly, who have been in roles like myself or Rich, who have been involved in labor for many years and have a certain level of expertise in the area. They do not need to be lawyers, but they can be. And AAA will give us a diverse selection to choose from. What I am happy to see is that we are seeing more and more women join AAA and be part of that process. And as a woman in labor, I think that that's a great thing. Primarily before it probably was mostly Caucasian men. And I think that we have moved away from that, and we're very interested in exploring opportunities to get other folks into this type of field and to offer some training. And that was one of the things that we really worked on in this round of negotiations. I mean, frankly, we would have been in arbitration this whole month of June had it not been for the pandemic. I have several dates on my calendar that have that, the previous Act 111 dates. But we strike the list and we select an arbitrator. I think that it is still just a myth of the FOP having ties to arbitrators. I mean, the FOP union is a very, very large organization, and many of their cases go to arbitration. So a lot of these arbitrators do get this from the FOP, but they also get it from other labor organizations throughout the city as well. We do try to pull arbitrators from different areas. There is a cost to that as well. Yes.
If you don't mind, just for the record, when you say business, can you clarify that for me? Explain what this receive business means.
So we select both parties. When we do the strike list, both parties have the opportunity to and for the city, my office receives the list of arbitrators from AAA. We manage that process. And we strike out, basically put on through the arbitrator that we would not want to select for a particular case. And then we rank in number order, every other arbitrator on the list that remains. And the union does exactly the same thing when they're in with the same exact list. AAA then takes that list and looks for a match. If we both have a pair for number one or number two, or whichever number that matches up, they then send back the name of the arbitrator who will hear that case, and then we select dates.
Who pays the arbitrator?
I'm sorry?
Who pays the arbitrator?
Both the city and the union split the cost.
Okay. All right. That's all I needed, just for the record.
Sure.
Just wanted to get clarity. And just give me the full name for the acronym AAA.
Sure. American Arbitration Association.
Okay. All right. That's the only questions I have. And thank you very much, Monica. Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Member Johnson. That is a interesting organization that will need some diversity and going forward. And I know that there are a number of qualified individuals that happen to be minority and female. Maria Egger, who is a lawyer and arbitrator, fits the mind. So I know if I thought about it, there'd be a dozen or so that I could think of. Who is next to ask a question, Ms. Williams?
Councilmember Green and then Councilwoman Gautier.
Councilmember Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the sponsors of today's legislation for your work and research and putting together this legislation and working along with the administration. I have a few quick questions for Mr. Laser and Ms. Marchetti-Brock. Mr. Laser, you talked about Act 111 and number of reforms, suggestions that the administration is making. At the state level, State Representative Donna Bullock is working on legislation regarding Act 11.
Yeah.
And so Act 111, has there been conversation with her? Have you provided input to her? I know she's introduced legislation. I believe there's a piece of legislation also introduced by State Representative Russ Diamond. So have you been working with her in reference to that legislation? Because that's where any real change would occur is in the General Assembly.
Yeah, so myself and the city solicitor, Marcel Pratt, are working on reforms that we'd like to see to the Act 111 process, and we will be submitting that to the delegation.
Okay. Also, one other quick question. Another issue that's come up, and my office has been doing some research on this issue regarding qualified immunity. I'm curious, in the collective bargaining agreement, is there any reference to qualified immunity in the CBA?
I'm not sure. Monica, is there?
Councilman, can you please repeat that question? I missed the last end.
Yeah, my question was, in the collective bargaining agreement that we've been discussing, is there any section or clauses in the CBA regarding qualified immunity?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Green. I want to recognize Member Gim, who is on the line, has joined us. And are you there?
I am present. Thank you.
Okay. Just wanted to put it on the record. Member Gautier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the benefit of the public, Deputy Mayor, can you talk about whether a contract award decision by an arbitration panel can be appealed, and how likely is a contract award to be overturned on appeal?
There's very fine area that can be appealed, and I think Monica probably has better specifics on what parts can be appealed.
Sure. So we mentioned, Councilwoman, we mentioned earlier about issues in dispute that are submitted to the arbitrator. An arbitrator has to stay within those issues in dispute. If an arbitrator were to award something that was completely outside of those issues, we would have grounds to appeal that. But like Rich said, it's very narrow on what we actually can appeal. So, and also it's the role of our party arbitrator to sort of guide that neutral back to the issues in dispute as well. So, I mean, there are some things that we have appealed in the past, and it does take a lot of time and resources to do that, which if an arbitrator overstepped its bounds, we do. And even on the grievance side, there have been times where the city has appealed cases and decisions all the way up for something that was outside of the arbitrator's authority. But it's very, very narrow.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
No more questions.
Thank you, Member Gautier. Who is next to be keyed up? Ms. Williams?
There were no more requests for questions. I think we can move on to the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And this is a part of a process that we're embarking upon, and it is probably one of the more important pieces that we will do this session. And with that, can you bring up the next panel to testify, Ms. Williams?
Juan Mano and Graciela Cristali.
Thank you for your patience, and we appreciate your insight on these matters. So could you begin your testimony, Mr. Manos?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, council members, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, as well as many other issues regarding police reform in the city. It's been inspiring to be a part of that and to support that, and I can't thank you enough for all the support. But thank you especially for the opportunity to testify in support of resolution number 200-364, which requires a public hearing prior to the execution of a labor agreement with city workers represented by the FOP. As City Council is aware, the residents of Philadelphia have been calling for police reform for decades. Often their calls for reform are received and shared by sympathetic police leaders. Though residents and police may share many priorities regarding needed reforms, calls for concrete action are often categorized as contract issues. The lack of specificity on this subject is alarming. It's alarming because these summaries do not offer concerned residents a path to advocate for the change they wish to see. Additionally, the scapegoating of an ironclad contract controlled by an intractable union allows police leaders to avoid any accountability. As a result of this, the police contract is the most consistently referenced issue at the monthly meetings hosted by the PAC. Residents ask the PAC what can be done about the contract and seem to believe that without contractual changes, there's nothing that can be done to improve policing in our city. At this point, I'll point to the fact that we have an explainer on arbitration, which was informed by the Mayor's Office of Labor Relations, as well as an infographic to try and help folks understand this process and to be responsive to their many concerns about this over the last 3 years. A review of the last 3 police contracts, which were publicly made available, indicate 3 immediate problems. Full resolution of these problems may require a change to state law. but City Council is not powerless to improve the situation. And this bill, which requires a more transparent and democratic process, will take an important step towards resolving these problems. The first problem is the discussion on discipline. Though it was clearly a priority for residents, the last 3 contracts rarely mention changes to discipline. The contracts do focus on financial issues, healthcare issues, and a myriad of other issues of importance to the police union. However, the references to any reform are noticeably absent. It's clear that changes related to discipline and the code have occurred. However, those do not seem to be embedded into the contracts. For instance, in 2010, then Commissioner Charles Ramsey unilaterally changed the disciplinary code. A new code was eventually agreed to in 2014. However, the code was not discussed in the contract. This has caused confusion for residents and city leaders who have been told the changes they desire are contract issues. There is encouragement to discuss discipline independently. In 2014, the police department was awarded the ability to hold discipline in abeyance. Apparently, this is one of the reforms which the police department desired. The contract stated, finally, the panel recognizes the importance of the reforms sought by the commissioner in the areas of discipline and promotions and encourages the parties to continue to discuss those that have not been awarded by the panel in this award. In this contract, any discussion and negotiation on reform has occurred and was encouraged to occur without public input, accountability, or transparency. That's unacceptable to the residents of the city. And finally, the contract priorities. The contracts which are available to the public highlight an end product and not any process or priorities. The priorities are clear and the hierarchy of the priorities, the priorities are unclear and the hierarchy of the priorities is virtually unknown. A democratic process would allow residents of the city to express which issues they prioritize and which issues they would be willing or unwilling to negotiate on. Perhaps most importantly, a democratic process would offer residents some agency and clarity over a disciplinary process, which often seems confusing and contract rules often framed as insurmountable. Police officers are agents of the government who are empowered to take away life and liberty. Historically, the way that they have exercised those powers has conjured up pain and anger. As the residents have organized in order to channel their feelings into change, they have been consistently referred to a faceless contract which they could not influence. With this bill, this will change. The residents of Philadelphia have declared that reforming the police department is a priority, and I support City Council for once again being responsive to the call for reform and for transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Please state your name for the record and begin yours. We will hold questions until the panel testifies. You need to unmute your mic. Don't worry about it. I do it all the time.
Good afternoon. My name is Graciela Chrisley. I am here to testify to the Bill 200364. I would like to thank the council for hearing me on this bill. I would like to state that I am appearing as a private citizen. I don't represent any groups. The opinions are my own. However, among other groups that I do belong to, I am a member of Reclaim Philadelphia. I have worked as an attorney in Philadelphia for the past 15 years, and the first 8 of those were spent as a criminal defense attorney working for the Defender Association of Philadelphia. And I'm here to testify today to an incident that might shed some light on why this bill is so important and why it's really only a first step. Given my education, given my work experience working with indigent criminal defendants in Philadelphia, I thought I knew a little bit about what my clients dealt with, about the police and the system. I would hear story after story of abuse, of citizens trying to do something about it, complaints of police brutality that would go nowhere except maybe in some file. I would shake my head and I would think about how fair it was that the system of police accountability we have here in Philadelphia wasn't designed to listen to people like my clients, the people who are most affected. But really, I was just naive. In 2014, I started to realize that the system isn't designed to listen to anyone. In 2014, in the spring of 2014, I was with two other friends. We were dropping my friend off at her house on Willows Avenue near 51st Street in West Philly. And we watched police officers. We didn't know they were police officers at the time. We watched police officers shoot Philip Holland several times. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit about that incident, not just because it's important to put it in context, but because the narrative that has been put out there about what occurred that night is inaccurate, to be polite. We were in my vehicle and the headlights were on in my car, and out of nowhere we see an individual dressed in street clothes step into the light cast by my headlights and open up, basically, just start shooting at a car. It was close enough that we could see the muzzle flash, and we screamed. My car was an SUV, and so there was room to get down in the footwell. We were terrified. I know I personally was convinced we were about to be carjacked because it was a running car, because what we thought of a crime had just occurred. Anybody trying to flee the situation might just jump in my car, and who knows what would have happened to us. When we felt safe to poke our heads up, we saw that the area was full of police officers, lights, sirens, and I felt a brief moment of relief because the shooter had been apprehended. But it was a very brief moment of relief because the shooter was standing there with police officers getting pats on the back, getting his hand shaken. He wasn't in custody. He was a police officer. And there was no way for us to know that at the time. He was not wearing anything that would have identified him as a police officer. He in no way, shape, or form identified him as a police officer before pulling out his gun and shooting. So as soon as we saw that, we knew something was wrong, right? That's not the way things are supposed to go down. Even if at that point we didn't know who Philip Holland was, turns out he was just a guy who was working two jobs to put himself through school. But even if he'd been a suspect or a criminal, that's just not the way that these things should be done, right? So we had just 3 trained criminal defense attorneys had just seen this go down. And we knew that it wasn't right. We were told to leave the area. We were not asked our names. We were not asked to give statements. Nobody seemed to care that we had witnessed this entire event. We were telling the police officer who was trying to get us out of there so that they could tape off the scene that we were dropping off my friend, that her house was right there. He told her to get out of the car and get in her house, wouldn't let her stand on the porch to see what was going on. He directed officers to help me turn my car around. I couldn't drive forward through the scene because that's where the shooting had taken place. So, and there were already emergency vehicles coming up behind my car, so they had to clear a path and get my car out of there. We were very shaken, but we knew that we needed to do something about it. At that time, like I said, we didn't know what the situation was with Mr. Holland. So my friend, who was still working at the Defenders Association at the time, made sure to let her supervisors know what we had witnessed in case Mr. Holland was arrested or the victim was arrested, that we not be assigned to his case in order to not create a conflict. We decided that we would give statements. So we went to the police district in West Philly and we gave statements. Again, the police officers took our statements, but they didn't seem to care about what we had to say. But once we gave the statements, we felt sure that something would happen, right? There would be something would occur, right? Maybe the police officers would get arrested, or maybe something would come out about what happened. But nothing like that happened. There were months that went by. Eventually, I was contacted by attorneys who were representing Mr. Holland. I agreed to work with them or provide any help that I could give. Ultimately, I didn't end up having to testify or anything because, as most of you or all of you know, the case settled, right? And talk about financial impact, $4.4 million. So I don't know if that counts as financially impactful to you, but $4.4 million that don't need to be spent, being spent on something like this is just offensive as a citizen, as a taxpayer. But what it did do is it drew so much attention, right? Because this was the largest ever, I think, in Philly, and one of the largest in the country for a police shooting. And so with so much attention being paid, we assumed that at this point maybe something would happen, right? Maybe these officers and their actions would be scrutinized. But it wasn't. Not only did nothing happen to these officers, but once the case settled, I guess they waited a little bit for it to die down. But then we were contacted by the city solicitor's office because they filed a grievance. They were grieving their 25-day suspensions. That's all they got. They got 25-day suspensions, and they had the audacity to grieve them. And we went, my friend and I, we testified. They wanted their back pay, they wanted promotions, all the things that have already been brought up and discussed. And after that, they were reassigned. They were just put back in other parts of the city. One of the parts of the city is where I live, South Philly. And nothing happened. Community groups were so outraged that there was a town hall. And you know what happened at the town hall? The deputy commissioner, I believe, at the time, basically stood there and told people that her hands were tied. The city's hands are tied. I think there's a quote that I pulled from an article that was written at the time. And she said, we have a lot, Deputy Police Commissioner Robin Waverly stated that we have a lot of rules and regulations that we have to follow. So if we fire an officer and the Fraternal Order of Police files a grievance and it goes to arbitration and the officer gets their job back, they also get all their back pay. Philadelphians deserve more than a system where the people in charge have their hands tied, which, by the way, is not imagery that I think is appropriate here, because this isn't having your hands tied. This is agreeing to have your hands tied, right? And what kind of system do we have where police officers can gun someone down in front of 3 trained criminal attorneys and it be determined that the shooting is so egregious that the city pays out one of the largest settlements ever, only to have the city, the police commissioners, everyone who's in charge just shrug and that say they can't do anything about it? And they can't do anything about it because nobody who's affected by this has any input. And that's why this bill is a step in the right direction, but it's only a step. Somebody, I believe the council member who sponsored this bill, Gilmore Richardson, stated that there are practices and procedures that have allowed structural racism to thrive in this city. And that's what happens when you work in the shadows. That's what happens when everything's behind closed doors. You allow things like racism, all of the ugly things that can pop up in everything from interpersonal relationships to city government. When it's behind closed doors, there's no way to stop that. And we have to, like was also stated, start on this path towards change, because if we don't, there's going to be another Philip Holland, and this time he may not survive. And after another Philip Holland, the city may not survive, because we've already seen what happens when enough people have been fed up with the racism, with the inability to be heard, with everything happening behind closed doors, and then when someone ends up dead or almost dead, the city saying, sorry, there's nothing we can do about it. So that's why I'm supporting this bill. I feel like it's very important, and I would really just like to thank everybody for starting down this path.
Thank you. Before we go in, Ms. Williams and T.F., I want you to know that just because you are elected and you are a council member doesn't mean you're not subjected to what you just talked about. I could hear the trauma in your voice when you describe what you saw. Speaking of trauma, I got a text from my daughter who heard you testify. And she wanted, I tell the story about the front page of the Daily News, high-risk warrant served at her house. I won't bore everybody with that, but she wanted me to remind you that the trauma lives on after the event. So I mention in that story often that my grandkids were at the top of the steps while their mother had a shotgun in her face at the bottom of the steps. I also mentioned that after they were allowed to get up and sit on the couch, how traumatized my grandbabies were. So much so that weeks later, my daughter, who is an auditor, she's a solid citizen in every sense of the word, got pulled over for a traffic violation, and the lights and the uniforms scared my grandkids so bad, one of them wet themselves in the back seat. As we have community police relations, that's not the kind of relationship we are striving for, fighting for with this type of legislation. So with that, Ms. Williams, who wants to ask questions?
Council Member Gilmore Richardson.
Member Richardson.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank you for your testimony and thank you for sharing your story and acknowledge also the trauma that I heard in your voice and just apologize for that happening to you and also to Mr. Holland. And I want to thank you for acknowledging that this legislation is just that, a first step. If you could briefly tell us what you think or some of your recommendations for next steps. And then Hans, I also had a question for you. If you could just notate for the record how you are empowered to conduct investigations and if you have subpoena power, et cetera, just for the benefit of the listening public. And if any of the contract terms relative to the FOP contract negotiations have prevented the advisory commission from doing your jobs. Oh, so.
Graciela, please go first.
Gracie, yeah.
Okay. So just to speak on the idea of trauma, right? There's the trauma of what happens in the moment, right? And one of the reasons I don't like discussing what occurred is because I can only speak through it through the lens of what I experienced. But ultimately, that experience wasn't about me. It was about what happened to Philip Holland. And so it feels almost selfish to talk about it through the lens of what I saw or what I experienced because I walked away from it, right? I'm here today to talk to you. I don't suffer what he suffered ongoing. He still has a seizure disorder from what I understand. But what I can speak to is the trauma of the aftermath, right? Because there's the trauma of the moment, but then there's the trauma that comes with the inevitability of the end result crushing you down, right? Knowing that nothing would happen to these officers, knowing that justice would never be served, knowing that they would get their jobs back or probably never even lose them in the first place is also trauma, right? It's an ongoing trauma that the people of Philadelphia face, primarily people of color in Philadelphia face. And one of the reasons I stated at the beginning of my testimony that I'm part of Reclaim Philadelphia is because it's a very pro-union group, right? I'm not here to say bad things about unions or to try and state that that's what's wrong here. But next steps definitely need to involve getting down to the nuts and bolts of dismantling parts of the union contract, parts of how that union functions, so that it can better serve the citizens of Philadelphia. Because I'm going to tell you this, after experiencing what I experienced, which, like I said, is only a fraction of what other people have experienced, it's hard for me to believe that the primary function of the FOP is anything other than to shield its individual members from the consequences of their actions. They've traded benefiting themselves at the cost of protecting the safety of the residents of Philadelphia. And that's not fair. Philadelphians deserve better. And I think that next steps definitely have to involve getting more access, right? Not just transparency. We've talked a lot about transparency, but transparency doesn't mean much if you're just looking in from the outside. You need access. You need access to what's going on in those negotiations. You need the access and the ability to say this is not what's going to happen. This isn't what's going to go in this contract. This isn't something that the citizens of Philadelphia are going to agree to be hampered by, to have to labor under. So I don't practice labor law. I'm still a lawyer. I'm no longer a criminal defense attorney. But labor isn't something that I've ever worked with, but there has to be a way. There has to be a way because, to use the imagery of the times, right? It's not that the city has its hands tied. It's that the city is currently on the ground with a knee on its neck, right? And there has to be a way to get that knee off of people's necks.
Are you done, member?
Yes, I'm done.
Yes.
So-
Thank you, Councilmember Hans.
Yes, so thank you for your questions. If I remember correctly, and thank you, Garcelle, for that powerful statement. The question was the PAC's powers in terms of our subpoena powers, is that correct? And any impact that the contract has on the PAC, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, the PAC, which exists by executive order, is empowered to issue subpoenas. We typically do not need to do that with the police department. We typically request information and at times discuss it. There have been some investigations where the police department has said no to our requests, and typically that has to do with an open investigation or other things that they feel or on advice of their counsel, they feel they did not have to give us the information when we asked for it. So that is admittedly rare, but it has occurred, and that's been troubling. In addition to that, a lot of the internal investigations are shielded from us on a case-by-case basis, but certainly are shielded from a lot of folks, and that's also something that's been troubling. As it relates to the contract, the contract may, in the new iteration of the Police Community Oversight Board, have some contact with the PAC or some friction, because if I understand correctly, the council desires a frontline investigation. If that is to occur, I would imagine the FOP, as it has historically, would challenge that. And when I say historically, that there is quite a bit of history here in the first iteration of the PAC in the 50s into the late 60s. There was a board that was disbanded based on a FOP court challenge that was initially won and then turned over on appeal. So we can learn from history, as we always can, about how the FOP may respond to any legislation or any charter change that this council is leading on. But right now, when we do make efforts to interview officers, which would be their primary challenge, we are doing so not in a non-disciplinary way, in terms of pursuing policy and practice. And so while they've been present for some of our interviews, they have not been able to effectively object because of what our goals are. If those goals change, I imagine that their objection might become stronger, and we'll have to deal with that then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Member Richardson. Who's next on the chat feature to ask questions? Ms. Williams.
There were no other members that indicated in the chat that they wanted to be recognized at this time.
Well, thank you both for your testimony and input. And these kinds of hearings allow the input to guide public policy. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
This is Councilman Thomas. I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank them both for the important testimony as well as the passionate testimony. No questions, but I do want folks to know that we hear them and these narratives matter a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Member Thomas. Ms. Williams, thank you all for your testimony. Who is the next panel to testify?
Michael Mellon, Dr. Mark Tyler, and Hannah Sassaman.
So we're going to, we have an ambitious witness list. We're going to go with a 3-minute testimony. Do we even have a clock, or does anybody have one?
do. I have a phone clock. I haven't used it much, but I think I can figure it out.
I appreciate your.
So I will.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. State your name and please, thank you for your patience and begin your testimony. Take it off mute. Take your mic off mute, please.
There we go. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yes.
All right. Well, I had planned for 5 minutes, so I'll try to bring this down to 3 minutes. My name is Michael Mellon, and thank you for having me here today, members of the Public Safety Committee. I work in the Police Accountability Unit at the Defender Association, and the Defender Association supports the legislation for a public comment period regarding the labor contract with the police union. Police are meant to be members of the public entrusted with guarding the health and safety of the communities they serve, which entails immense powers of arrest, detention, and deprivation of liberty, powers that no other citizens possess. We must redefine policing as guarding the safety of our communities with the support of the people, not despite their opposition. This requires independent, transparent oversight so that Philadelphians can feel confident that this power is not being abused. The public comment period is but one piece of a larger accountability framework that creates a check on those who are given the powers which, if abused, can trample on the human dignity and the constitutional rights of those they were sworn to serve. The public needs input on any contract negotiations, but they also need the power to be informed about the behavior of their police, which only a transparent and independent disciplinary process can provide. In these last weeks, we have seen both the stunning lack of accountability of the Philadelphia Police Department and how the transparency and community engagement can make all the difference. It was the people who indicted Staff Inspector Bologna. Yes, he was charged by the District Attorney's Office, but not because the police department decided to hold Bologna accountable. It only happened because of the work of the people who identified him, who distributed videos of his violence, and who brought his long history of misconduct to light. Despite what we all saw as a crime and what the police department would call a crime if one of our clients had been caught on video doing the same thing, the police department could not figure out how to bring charges against him as if he were any other citizen. And let's remember, there's another officer that has not been charged despite clear evidence of inexcusable assault. That officer that pulled down the masks of the two people kneeling on 676 and pepper sprayed them directly into the face. If he had been a regular citizen, he would have been arrested and charged. Our clients get charged much faster with much less evidence. Despite the video evidence provided by the public, the police department will not tell who he is. So here we are, weeks after the incident occurred on video, still waiting for the police department to bring charges, or at least identify this officer to the district attorney's office so they can charge him. In the meantime, the police department has brought charges to the district attorney against hundreds of our clients for their alleged actions during the protest. It didn't take the police department any time to bring these charges to the district attorney. If I can just sum up. In the last year, our unit has obtained video evidence that substantiates allegations of perjury against 6 officers. The police department has not brought charges against any of them. I guarantee you that Bologna and this other officer are just the tip of the iceberg. We cannot have public safety without public trust in the police department. To that end, the Defender Association supports public comment period as one part of a broader strategy to reform the disciplinary and arbitration processes and hold the police accountable to the communities they serve. Thank you.
You're on mute, Councilman Jones.
I told you I'd do it too. Can you stick around, please, so that the rest of the panel can testify, and then we might want to ask questions?
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. You ready for me, Councilman?
Yes. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you. This is Mark Kelly Tyler, and I serve as the pastor of Mother. Pardon me?
I couldn't see you.
They had me on the telephone.
All right now.
They wouldn't let me in the room. I testified yesterday, and they wouldn't let me back in, so this is as close as I can get.
All right.
Thank you. Can we restart my 3 minutes, please?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Mark Kelly Tyler. I serve as the senior pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church and co-chair of Power's Live Free campaign, and Power supports Bill 200364. For too often, the notion of public safety has been a one-way conversation where it has been assumed that we're talking about law enforcement keeping the public safe from crime. However, as recent incidents in our nation have reminded us, public safety is a two-way street. The question many of us ask is who will keep us safe from rogue officers on the force and those who enable them? Certainly not the FOP. Time and again, bad actors have continued to maintain their employment while being protected by the ultimate lobbying body, the FOP. The FOP has fought to protect those who post racist content on social media. They lined up to cheer a man who beat an innocent protester in the head on camera, and they defend those who shoot unarmed black men in the back while running away. We don't need to go to Minneapolis Council. We can turn on our local news. Let us never forget the killing of unarmed Brandon Tate Brown and David Jones, both in the same police district. Throughout our nation, the demand to defund the police has taken hold. Why does defund sound so outrageous to some? Doesn't our current budget defund just about everything from education to the district attorney's office? But the call to defund is not just about punishing the police. If we say that more money will make us safe, then why hasn't a 30% increase in spending not led to fewer shootings and homicides? Instead, we need to pour millions of dollars into proven anti-violence programs to stop killings before they happen and not just show up to pick up the pieces afterward. It is time to defund policing in the same way, in the way that we have known it, a way that does not keep us safer. Instead, we must invest money into things that will keep us safe and save lives. Let's put money into the people. Police officers should not have to respond to issues of schools, of the homeless, or persons who have mental health challenges. There are professionals who can do it. The challenge to getting to the reforms that we demand is the current, behind closed doors, done in the dark way of negotiating the contract. It's time to turn on the light, bring the process out into the public, and hear from the people who suffer from the hands of ineffective policing in order that we can make this police department a force that we can all be proud to claim as our own. We urge you to pass the bill out of committee, and we're grateful to Councilmember Gilmore Richardson for introducing it, and to the other members who are pushing similar reforms to policing. But I also want to acknowledge and thank, before I close, those persons who really have us here. It's a shame that it took the lives of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and now Rashard Brooks to get us here. We hope that there will one day be a day where black folk don't have to die in order to get meaningful change. And I want to recognize the millions of people, including the young people who marched today, who, if they had not been in the streets and lifted their voices, perhaps we would not be having this hearing today. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you for your testimony. Are there questions for these two panel witnesses? Ms. Williams?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but we did have one more panelist on this panel, and then Councilwoman Gim would like to be recognized for questions. Yes.
All right, so Member Gim, we're going to let the final person on this panel testify, and then we'll recognize you shortly thereafter.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. State your name and begin your testimony, please.
Thank you so much, Chairman Jones. Can people hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. So Chairman Jones, Vice Chair Johnson, Councilmember Richardson, and all of the other council members here today, and members of our community, thank you for asking us to testify. Before I summarize my testimony, I just wanted to let everyone who's watching and listening know that right now there is a community-led occupation of the lobby of the Municipal Services Building, where community members are demanding more defunding of the police and accountability and transparency, which are the issues we're discussing today in these important bills. I will also note that a story came out in the Inquirer less than an hour ago showing that there was no aggression on 676 that supposedly prompted the tear gassing and kettling of peaceful protesters. And I will share the story about that in the chat so you can look at it. It's also on Twitter on Philly We Rise. And finally, Commissioner Outlaw, if you're listening, your officers just arrested a reporter named Samantha Melamed, who has covered the criminal justice system with a lot of integrity for many years, and it would be great if you would release her as she's covering the protest at MSB. To speak to these very, very important bills that are on the table today. Our organization has been part of amplifying the clear demands from every community in the city that our resources are best spent on the services that make our neighborhoods thrive, and that our priorities are out of whack if we put most of our budget into policing, imprisonment, and prosecution. That is why we think it is so essential that this bill pass and that organizing around the FOP contract be done instead of with doors shut tight to the communities that should have the heaviest and highest role in determining how police officers are held accountable in a city with one of the highest per capita number of police to community members in the United States, with as much transparency as possible. We think that the amendment to the bill makes this bill even stronger. As we clamor in the streets, both in Philly and around the country, to defund a lavishly funded police department at a time of extraordinary austerity and cuts to city resources, we must replace over-policing with the supports and services that can deal with harm and public safety at far less cost. Transparency around this contract is an absolutely essential component of that. I will then say that the final thing I'll say, as I know my time is probably almost up, is that this hearing is just a beginning, and we would love to work both with council and in our communities about what kind of community education we need to do starting tomorrow on understanding the role of the Fraternal Order of Police contract, making sure that our engagement in that process is happening simultaneously with the city's negotiation, and that we're getting the education we need across the city to begin that process now of talking about what our demands and values are as we try to make sure that the resources tied up in this contract are reinvested in communities. We need to understand if we have the power to push on wages and benefits, the number of officers, put millions back into rec centers and education. And I will say, just to close out, the different kinds of lawsuits that we were mentioning that earlier in this hearing that Graciela in particular was describing, the millions upon millions that have been paid out to victims of police abuse are extremely important. So engaging in discipline and transparency into discipline is also a big part of saving money so we can defund the police and invest in our communities. I'm grateful and thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you for your testimony. Chair recognizes Member Gim.
Yes, thank you very much. First, I just want to acknowledge the sponsor of this bill and thank her for her leadership on this issue and for working so hard to make sure that not only what does the bill make the most amount of sense, like it fits with these times, but more importantly, it speaks to these times. And so thank you very much, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. I also want to acknowledge the three testifiers here today because not only for their expert testimony, but for years of work that they have done on policing, contracting, on behaviors, corrective, and support for a humane and fair and just budget. And I'd like to give them a little bit more time because I know you were speaking right to this particular bill, the urgency of it. But one of the things I would like to hear, and if I could, Council, Mr. Chairman, you can speak to how much time that they can have, but I would like to hear just a little bit more about their past experiences that they have had in addressing the police contract specifically, because I think what's missing a little bit is the ability to speak to a level of history around this work, why it's been so intractable, and from these three different perspectives, from Mr. Mellon, Reverend Tyler, and from Ms. Sassman, like the ways that they have seen the biggest blocks happening. And I'd love to just leave it open to them. Thank you.
Remember, again, it's a form of a question. They have to respond, so take the time necessary.
We can start with Mr. Mellon and just go in order. Mr. Mellon, Reverend Tyler, and then Ms. Sussman.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Council Member. To answer your question, I guess what I would say is that what we see is that basically it's not just the contract negotiations, it's not just the disciplinary process, and it's not just the arbitration process. It's as a whole collectively, it needs to be reformed, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be independent. From our perspective, and this goes to the previous witness's testimony regarding Mr. Holland's shooting, the officers are regularly getting their jobs back, but this is not just a problem of arbitration. This starts way before that with the investigation process, and that's why I wanted to highlight the difference between the two officers during the protests most recently, and how one officer who the district attorney's office was able to identify was able to charge that officer, but the officer that no one knows, but I think everyone would agree committed a crime, has not been charged yet. This starts with the police department. This starts with their own investigation. I've seen the internal affairs policies and procedures. They're designed to fail. I've seen testimony from superior officers at what they call police board of inquiry hearings, where a superior officer admitted in that hearing, which is a misconduct trial for another officer, that he hid evidence from the police department, but he gave it to the FOP. So this goes, I think it's a cultural problem, and it goes deeper than just what we're talking about today. And the public comment period is an important part, but this whole thing needs to be redesigned and open and transparent and separated from the police department as much as possible in order for the communities to feel safe and feel trust in going to the police. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Tyler?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I'm sorry, Chairman Jones, I didn't recognize you at the outset. The AME in me will not allow that to happen. So thank you for having me at this committee hearing. Let me just say that, so Power Live Free has been working on this for some time. In fact, Dave Lipscomb, I'm not sure if he's listening, he's a layperson who belongs to our team. And he was the first one to really bring the contract to our attention several years ago. I wish this could be called the Dave Lipscomb bill, because he had a very traumatic experience with the police, being pulled over, accused of driving a stolen car, which was his. But he has zeroed in on this from the very beginning. And so we had a lot of hope that this current contract that was extended would be a different kind of process. As you know, Power Live Free back in December had a town hall along with Malcolm Jenkins and a ton of other organizations like Media Mobilizing Project and others. And we were actually calling for a number of the things that are now being turned into legislation. Independent police advisory oversight, and end the stop and frisk, the residency requirement, and most importantly for us, an end to the broken grievance system and arbitration, which begins in this process. We were told by the administration, the mayor's administration, that, we'd hear from them, we'd be kind of brought along through the process. And in the beginning, it was very promising. We had conversations, They shared with us what they were aiming to do. This is before they went into formal negotiations, so it wasn't out of order. And then all of a sudden, like everyone else, we heard about the extension. It's just done. What that says to me is that we cannot just simply trust on the benevolence of the mayor, whoever she or he is in the future. We really need a law that will be binding, that gives people voice in the process. You know, this is our city. And I've said to law enforcement before, to the past commissioner and to others as well, that the police department belongs to us. It's not theirs. You know, those are our cars, they're our guns, they're our batons. Everything that they have belongs to us. We give them the power to police us. We give them the money to police us. And for anyone to tell us as citizens that we don't have a place at the table for every part of how they police us, you know, then they apparently don't know American history. It started in this country, the whole we the people part. And so nothing is more fundamental than the contract between the police department and the people. And it should not be left to one person or to several people, but everybody in this city should have access, like we're doing right now, to have our voice heard, even if the mayor does something different, to at least have our voice heard. And we believe that doing this in the open will put the kind of public pressure so that the kind of deal making that we have seen in the past will no longer happen. So again, I'm thankful. I want to say I think this can go further, but this is a very good start of a new kind of process. So again, I want to thank this.
Hello?
We might have lost you, Reverend Tyler.
I'm finished.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend.
And thank you very much, Councilmember Gim, for asking me to respond to that, and also again to Councilmembers Jones, Johnson, Gilmore Richardson, and everyone for letting us debate these important issues. I think that Reverend Tyler really hit it right on the head. Like, he and I, as well as honestly dozens of others, worked really hard all throughout the fall to try to figure out what is the purchase that communities can have into this contract. And then when we heard during the shock of coronavirus, as we were all trying to tend to our people during that time that suddenly that contract was settled, part of us was like, okay, great, we have a little bit more time. But then when we figured out what the budget implications were of that, not just a 2.5% raise to each officer, but a $750 bonus for each one at a time when thousands of people, both public and private employees, were losing their jobs. That bonus, just that $750 for each of those 6,000 folks, adds up to about $5 million. That's more than the amount of money that was invested in the Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy, where so many people, primarily like Black and brown artists across our city, were clamoring for support. And so we really see this piece of legislation as one important step, not a complete step, but a massive step to permit us to actually be able to have a deep understanding of what's happening in this contract, what the financial implications are, which is why I consistently am bringing up the demand we're hearing in the streets to invest in community supports and services instead of just police, to defund the police. And so it's going to take both this hearing. We're happy that it's happening before any tentative agreement is really gone into, that will permit that kind of conversation. But we really are counting on this committee, on these members of council, as well as other apparatuses in the city, to really help our neighbors across the city engage with this process considerably earlier, so that that hearing and other apparatus of public support for a different kind of contract can happen considerably earlier and with a lot more rigor and skill. And that's something we'll be focusing on, of course, but it's also something that council has the power to do in all of the councilmatic districts in the city. And so we just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you. Member Gim, are you done?
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to thank all the testifiers and witnesses today for their tremendous leadership on this issue over many years.
Thank you. Ms. Williams.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to echo the sentiments of my colleague, Councilmember Gim, in acknowledging the witnesses of the last panel Mr. Mellon from the Defenders Association, Reverend Dr. Mark Tyler, and Hannah Sassaman, who I've had the pleasure of working with for a very long time, even back to my days as a legislative aide under the tutelage of Councilmember Blondell Reynolds Brown. So thank you so much for your continued work, your advocacy and leadership on these issues. And as everyone has stated thus far, we recognize that this is just a first step, and we look forward to working with you on the steps ahead. So thank you so much.
You remember what I asked you to do, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, I do, sir.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones.
All right, Ms. Williams?
There are no other members with questions, so we can move on to the next panel.
All right, who is the next panel to testify?
Naima Sanchez and Mark Steyer.
Thank you for your patience. Are you there?
I am. This is Mark.
All right. Okay, Mark, state your name for the record and please begin your testimony.
Thank you. My name is Mark Steer. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Budget.
Mark
Policy
Steer.
Center.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yes.
All right, that's Mark Steer. All right, not Mark Steyer. All right.
Okay. I will give an abbreviated version of my written testimony here. I speak to you at a moment in which police abuses of and violence towards members of our community, especially members of the Black community, is becoming more widely acknowledged due to the horrific murder of George Floyd and many other widely publicized and deeply disturbing incidents in recent years. However, these problems have been well known for decades. There are 4 thick reports on the PPD sitting on my desk and a shelf of books behind me going back to 1968 and 1973 that document the long history of tension and violence between the police and Black communities here and elsewhere in the country. These and many books reach 2 conclusions. First, while the police serve many useful purposes, the number and manner of policing has relatively little impact on crime rates. Crime is driven largely by poverty, by blocked opportunities, by mental illness. If we want to reduce crime, we must invest in our communities to deal with these deeper problems. Second, our city as well as our country has persistently responded to crime with ever more aggressive and militarized policing. These policies are only put in place because of racist assumptions about the need for the police to monitor and control Black people. I say all this with no malice towards police officers, and frankly with some sympathy for the position we put them in. It's commonplace to say that the problem with the police is a few bad apples. But the problems with policing in America and Philadelphia is not a matter of individual police officers. Some try hard to respect the rights of civilians, and some do not. But all of them face a deeply structural problem. We have put police officers in a very difficult situation. We ask them to intervene in communities in ways that are bound to escalate tensions and to put them in danger. We should not be surprised then when police officers too often respond with violence that makes sense to them in the moment, but results in the death of civilians who have done nothing to deserve it. One small but necessary step to address these issues is for the public to look at the contractual agreements between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police that makes police accountability difficult, if not impossible, in Philadelphia and other cities, as others have testified about today. I support this proposed legislation for another reason as well. I started my testimony talking about the long history of reports and studies about police violence in America and Philadelphia. We simply cannot let this moment be another one in which we talk about problems and then move on to something else. If nothing else, I hope that the public hearings required under this important legislation will be a permanent opportunity for members of council and the public at large to keep pushing for the deep transformation in policing and in our society that we so badly need. Thank you for taking my testimony today and for your work on this important legislation.
Thank you, Mark. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony. And thank you again for your patience. Take your mic off.
Hello.
And to put them in danger. We should not be surprised that
Somebody needs to mute their phone.
Pardon me?
Okay. The death of civilians will get nothing to deserve it.
All right, somebody's watching TV. All right, can we get the next witness to testify, please.
Naima Sanchez, can you please unmute yourself and begin your testimony?
Thank you. And that actually sounds like a recording of this hearing. So good afternoon, council members and colleagues. My name is Naima Sanchez, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program coordinator for the Transjustice of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I want to start by thanking Councilmember Gilmore Richards, Chairman Jones, and Vice Chair Johnson, and other council members for supporting this space. The following testimony is on behalf of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. As an organization, we have been fighting for police transparency and accountability, as well continuing working with hand in hand with coalitions and community members to create a change in system that is embedded in history of white supremacy and a legacy of slavery and abuse. When it comes to developing solutions to establishing a culture of transparency, we have to look at the police unions and contract negotiations. As public servants, police should be fully accountable to the communities that they serve. So how is it that the community has no say in how funds are allocated and how the police union and contracts impede public access to records and fail to create a system of accountability? As city council members, your obligation is to the people of Philadelphia. Understanding that your power is not limited solely to budgetary matters, we appreciate and support your efforts to create ordinances that will move us in the right direction for reform. Bill number 364 is a starting point in incorporating and considering the voices of the people of the community for transparency. The anger and frustration that we are seeing in our streets must not be ignored, but supported. And the community deserves to have a say in police union contract negotiations. And to reiterate an earlier point that I made, this is a starting point with this bill. And we organizationally and as a part of the community are leaning on all members of City Council to use their role and power to do more, making adjustments as needed. While this bill would require the public hearing be held and the public allowed to testify prior to the acceptance or amendments of any police labor union contract in Philadelphia, we must make sure that the voices are not restricted. We want to make sure that community members are well informed of the process and the opportunity for their concerns to be heard, recognizing the open public hearing may not be sufficient. Budgets are the way money is spent. I'm sorry?
Please continue.
Budgets and the way money is spent are clearly a reflection of the priorities of the city, and now is the time to shift our focus and prioritize the people through the reallocation of resources of the police budget that makes up 14% of the total city's budget. Now is the time to propose and pass ordinances that restructures police oversight, allow the advisory board for the actual power to hold police accaccountability and gain.
Okay. Well, they got me on the phone. They got me on the phone.
Ma'am, hold up. Somebody is off mute, and you're talking on the phone, and everybody can hear you. So
Hello?
please put your phone on mute.
Hello?
We still can hear you. I apologize for that interruption. Please continue.
Thank you, Chair. Now is the time to propose and pass an ordinance that restructures police oversight and allows advisory boards the actual power to hold police accountable and gain transparency. We want to create a system for access to police disciplinary records, as the distrust in the police is at a high, as well as transparency around disciplinary policies. Reallocating funding is to efforts to ensure the marginalized communities are treated equitable and to protect and strengthen Black communities. Invest in community solutions to safety, such as affordable housing, public health approaches to violence prevention, education, access to mental health, and other resources. We support the demand for change, and we all have much work to do in addressing systematic inequalities and institutional racism to change that effect and sustain. We all have to do our part in using our voices. No longer is silence an option or justifiable. Thank you for the time and your support on this bill, and we look forward to working with all you to fight against structural racism and creating systematic change.
Thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. And forgive us for the interruption. We're working with technology and people. It's an interesting combination. All right, Sam, are you there?
Yes, I am here. There's no messages in the chat from members wanting to be recognized.
Okay.
We can go to the next panel.
All right.
The next panel is Tu Huyen.
Okay, I am here. Hi, thank you. My name is Tu Huyen, and I'm here today as a private citizen in support of Bill 200364. Earlier this month, I was laid off from the city's Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy. For over 16 years, I ran the Art in City Hall program, transforming the People's Building into a platform for our culture community by providing opportunity, voice, and representation in the most important civic space in Philadelphia. Now in this urgent and opportune hour, when our city and country have finally risen to challenge our inherently biased criminal justice system where Black lives do not matter, we demand action to end this long pandemic of systemic racism and the cultural police brutality that embraces it. And in Philadelphia, the arts deserves an opportunity to be at the table when budgetary negotiations are being made between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police. We demand that our voices, the tens of thousands who marched in protest as well as signed petitions, to be heard through public hearings led by our elected representatives, because our votes should matter, because our tax dollars are administered should matter, because transparency should matter, and above all, because Black lives should matter. When I heard the Fraternal Order of Police was getting a pay raise during this new Great Depression, and that their signing bonus alone would amount to $5 million, I thought to myself, how can I tell my children that I lost my job due to COVID-19? Knowing full well there was an alternative to eliminating the Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy, and 7 of its 9 employees. You cannot say you are for working families when you don't allow valuable public service to work for their families. My colleagues worked hard, played by the rules, consistently went above and beyond the call of duty. They deserved better. A signing bonus could have saved everyone's jobs, and possibly some of the 108 full-time city government employees. A signing bonus for a police union as broadcasted on CNN that fired tear gas and rubber bullets into a crowd of protesters on 676. A union that protects an officer who viciously beat up a Temple University student, whose officers either stood by or shook hands with armed white vigilantes as they bullied and abused peaceful protesters in Kensington and in South Philly, and prevented the media from doing its job. That essentially stood around protecting a statue of a racist former mayor, while looters and outside agitators destroyed our vital business corridors and communities, and a union that consistently perpetuates an us versus them culture during a time when our city and country desperately call for reform, ready to embrace 21st century policing through community engagement, de-escalation, and implicit bias training. The fate of one of the most diverse cities of America during this critical juncture in our history needs true, transparent democracy. Not only does the public deserve to be present, the arts in particular deserve a seat at the table. For $5 million, we could have genuinely restored arts funding and invested in our economic recovery, and rally the cultural community to not only help in the fight this global pandemic, but through civic engagement, help heal the divide between police and the community. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, a major role in rebuilding America. Similar vision and courage today. We could have for the entire Office of Arts, Culture, and Creativity. Statues and monuments are a national issue. We do not expect 2 retained members to handle the rigors of public art. There are about 24 ongoing percent work and rebuild.
We're having some trouble hearing your audio. Try a little tampering there. Try again.
Try this again. For $800,000, we could have restored.
That's better.
Hear me now?
Yes.
For $800,000, we could have restored the entire Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy. During a time when historic statues and monuments are a national issue, we cannot expect 2 retained staff members to handle the rigors of public art, let alone the many other functions of the office. There are about 24 ongoing percent art projects and rebuild projects on the way, in addition to sculpture maintenance and conservation. And now, a crisis in Marconi Plaza demands attention. We need to respect process. Having the right people in place to engage communities, work with artists, and forge partnerships is critical. For example, for the ongoing Bethel Burying Ground project in Queen Village, the site of a rediscovered 19th century black cemetery over a small public playground, it took an entire team working across city agencies and the community to lay the groundwork for a future monument that will finally pay respect to the vision of Bishop Richard Allen, Philadelphia's historic free black community, and the extraordinary lives buried there. The City Hall exhibit alone required a dozen partners and 49 artists. 2 staff members alone could not have done that. History matters. Public art matters. The Office of Arts, Culture, and Economy matters. And in addition to reinvesting in the African American Museum in Philadelphia for $350,000, we could have kept the entire budget of $3.14 million for the Philadelphia Culture Project. 349 grants were given to the office this past year. With last week's budget agreement, slashing PCF to a mere $1 million may be disproportionately affecting over 200 small organizations that serve impoverished communities. City Council, I urge you to revisit this. You've witnessed countless testimonies. The arts are about people and communities. Equity matters. Access and opportunity matter. Transferring a signing bonus for the Fraternal Order of Police and reinvesting it in the OACCE and the culture community would mean the city is open to exploring new perspectives and approaches to public safety, where civic engagement around contemporary issues has long been an essential role of the arts. We need the arts to help lift and heal our communities. Which is more important, a bonus to a department in conflict or the survival in office that will benefit the lives of every citizen? The public wants transparency in the budgetary process. It demands justice and civil rights once and for all, and true reform that can only begin with the pressuring and defunding of the Fraternal Order of Police.
We're going to have to thank you for your testimony. Your time has expired.
That matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Williams?
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize and thank too for his testimony, and not only for his testimony, but his 16 years of dedication to City Hall. If you have worked in City Hall over the last few years, at any point you have met too and have seen his work ordain the halls of City Hall on every floor. So I just wanted to acknowledge you, say thank you for your testimony. Know that we continue to work on your behalf and fight for you and the entire arts community because we know that work is so important. So I just wanted to acknowledge you and say thank you and know that we are continuing to fight on your behalf. Thank you so much, too. Thank you.
Yeah, two is my secret weapon, and he would explain the art to me.
Yeah.
I was culturally, he would explain why this art was meaningful and explain the hidden meanings in the colors. So I appreciate what he's always done on the fourth floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right.
Councilmember Green.
Take your phone up. Take your mic off mute, sir. Adjust your mic. Member Green, we can't hear you. We will come back to you when you get the mic situation corrected. Member Williams? Member Williams. Sam?
You get a motion.
She deserves it.
There aren't any other requests besides Councilmember Green.
Can you hear me now, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair? Yes, my input to my computer was off a little bit, so I apologize. I also want to thank you, Councilman Jones, for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to echo the comments of Councilman Catherine Gilmore Richardson. I also have spent a lot of time in City Hall, a lot of time on the 5th floor in particular, and too, in his work, especially the art in City Hall, and just having the opportunity over the years to see a diversity of organizations and people that he was able to bring into City Hall, the People's House, from the senior community, people that had a physical learning difference, like my son on the autism spectrum. There's a whole host of perspective. And so often I was, in City Hall late at night, and I would walk through the 5th floor and just seeing the work that he's been able to do in City Hall and bringing so many different cultures and perspective into the city. I was definitely heartbroken in reference to what happened for his office, but I thank him for, even in this pandemic, even in what has happened, still being an advocate for the arts and culture community and being a shining example of the best of our city employees. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Graham. Ms. Williams, next panel to
There are no other members who asked to be recognized, so we can move on to the next panel, which will be Patricia Eakin, Alex Baumstein, and Renai Bejam.
Thank you all for your patience, and please state your name and begin your testimony.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Jones and members of City Council. My name is Patricia Aiken, and I live in the Lawncrest section of the city, and I've been a Philadelphia resident since 1970. I'm a retired registered nurse. I worked as a visiting nurse in Southwest Philly for 7 years, and I worked at Temple University Hospital for 35 years, the last 17 in the emergency room. I'm also an executive board member of 215 People's Alliance. I've been a union activist and labor leader all of my nursing career and served as president of my union, PASNAP, until I retired, including 13 years as a statewide president. I want to note that I'm not speaking on behalf of the union since I'm retired, but my experience as a nurse and a fighter for workers' rights is relevant to my testimony. I am in support of Ordinance 200364 to allow for public hearings and public input on changes to the FOP contract prior to the mayor entering into bargaining. Like all workers, I think the police have the right to form a union, but the police are very different from other workers in quite a few key ways. One is that they have immense power in their hands, the power of life and death over members of the community. They have the power to arrest and deprive someone of their liberty, to take them from their family. They have the power to ruin lives, and we have seen how their misuse of power is disproportionately directed at Philadelphia's Black and brown community. They seem to have the power to beat people up with clubs, as we have seen them do during the recent protests in support of Black Lives Matter and against police brutality. In fact, proving their brutality during the protests against their brutality. And they have the power to stand aside and let white vigilantes threaten or injure protesters, as happened to a member of our organization last week. With that vast power must come some kind of accountability, yet this union has almost no accountability. As a nurse, I had a potentially big impact over the life and well-being of my patients, and I and other healthcare workers were always held accountable for our practice. Mistakes and serious negative outcomes are investigated to look for the root cause. I bargained many contracts in my day, and we always strove for fairness in our contracts, but accountability for our actions was a given. In the words of A. Philip Randolph, the essence of a union is social uplift of workers and the community. So a union is not a shield to evade, obscure, and obstruct accountability. And that is even more true for such workers who have the power to inflict harm and death. While due process is a vital part of all contracts, it shouldn't mean demanding that incompetent or dangerous workers are at the bedside or policing the community. Is my 3 minutes up already?
Yeah.
I have one more little paragraph and then I will be done. Say this bill is a good first step in the direction of police reform, but much more has to be done. The police should be defunded and policing needs to be reimagined. It's a failed, flawed, racist system that has not made the city safer and is a dangerous place for people of color who are targeted. That money should be spent on education, housing, healthcare, libraries, recreation, youth programs, counselors, and I will add Art after the last testifier. So I am finished, and I thank you for your time, and I thank you for doing this legislation.
On behalf of all of the frontline nurses that have meant so much during this pandemic, thank you.
Thank you.
Sam?
Alex Baumstein, are you on the line?
I am, yes.
Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you. My name is Alex Baumstein. Thank you, Council, and thank you, Chair Jones, for taking the time to listen to the public's comments on this important bill. I want to speak with you just very briefly about my personal experience with the Philadelphia Police Department on June 14th this year. So I live in South Philly. Occasionally I spend time in Marconi Plaza when my wife and I go down there for a walk. The weekend of the 14th, a large crowd was gathered in the park around the Christopher Columbus statue. That Sunday night, I heard a request for legal observers in the park. Legal observers, to explain, they monitor demonstrations, and in particular, they record observations of police interactions with civilians. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a trained legal observer. So I put on my bright green legal observer hat, and I went to the park to observe, arriving around 9 p.m. Shortly after I arrived, the police at the park were walking with a mob of angry white people and expelling everybody but the mob from the public park, and also from the sidewalk next to the park. I heard the mob yelling threats of violence at a handful of people facing them. Then the white mob began shoving people into the busy intersection of Broad and Oregon. I personally was shoved by a man screaming and threatening me while the police merely looked on. To be clear, the police were standing with and among the mob of white men threatening violence and then committing violence. The police told these men to, quote, do what you got to do to those who dared stand on a public sidewalk. The police said that they would leave public safety up to the mob that evening. Why am I and my neighbors paying taxes for a police department that condones violence so long as it's by police officers or other white men that stands back to watch a violent mob assault myself and my South Philly neighbors? Philadelphians deserve a voice in the negotiations over a police contract. We will say loud and clear that Black Lives Matter means officers being held accountable, and that Black Lives Matter means defund the police and invest in our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Williams?
Renee Begum?
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Rani Begum. I am from the Philadelphia Red Umbrella Alliance. For those of you who don't know about us, we are an all-volunteer collective of sex workers dedicated to ending stigma and violence towards sex workers through labor organizing, advocacy, and decriminalization. In lieu of this, I'd like to publicly testify in support of Bill 200-364. We need public hearings about the police contract and how force is used against Philadelphians. Earlier this year, in March of 2019, as a safety response to COVID-19, Philadelphia decided to stop arrests for minor offenses. This included arrests for charges related to narcotics and prostitution. We learned then that arrests of these crimes have nothing to do with public safety. In fact, arrest and jailing of citizenry puts them and other Philadelphians in further danger and elevates public health disasters. So then it has really brought into question what public safety and community welfare looks like. In the ongoing months, as a community organizer, I witnessed how difficult it has been to get COVID-19 testing and personal protection equipment to the people I serve. Never mind things like sanitation and safer housing. I also witnessed that we were able to easily deploy police. In fact, we are easily deploying police today, wearing full personal protection equipment against protesters that have broken out in the last few weeks. As a community organizer, I am continuously told that the best interest of my community can only ever really be achieved by voting. Philadelphia City Council, you were voted in. You have been told through public protest, these testimonies, op-eds, and public calls on social media that we need this hearing. We can't vote the police out. That we have to ask for a public hearing in and of itself is preposterous. But these tax dollars are ours. Clearly, arresting criminalized persons such as myself does not protect Philadelphians. So we really, really need to look at how these tax dollars are being used. We really need these public hearings on police contracts and the use of force against Philadelphians. We need a better, more transparent view of what public safety and community welfare looks like. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Williams, who's next?
I don't believe any of the, actually, I'm sorry. Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson.
Member Richardson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank all of the witnesses who provided testimony in the last panel, and particularly note for the record, Pat, our longtime registered nurse who we worked with in council for many years. Thank you so much for recognizing my fraternity brother, the late, great A. Philip Randolph, who organized and led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Richardson. Who's next, Ms. Williams?
I believe if there are no other questions from the council members, then we can move on to the witness list for the next bill.
Okay, can you once again read the number and title of the bill?
Sure.
I think it's 200-368.
Bill number 200368, an ordinance amending Title 10 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Regulation of Individual Conduct and Activity by adding a new chapter, 10-2500, entitled Prohibited Physical Contact by Peace Officers to prevent unnecessary death or injury via asphyxiation by prohibiting certain physical contact by peace officers, all under certain terms and conditions.
Thank you. Is the author of this legislation, do you want to say anything else, or can we bring up the first panel to testify?
You can go ahead and bring on the first. You can go on and bring on the first panel to testify. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Member Johnson. And who would that be, Ms. Williams?
Commissioner Danielle Outlaw, Sheriff Rochelle Bilal, and Chief Thomas Dale.
Thank you for your patience as we dealt with the first ordinance. I appreciate you sticking around, and you have a lot to do, but we appreciate it. Would you state your name for the record and begin your testimony, Commissioner Outlaw?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you. Chairman Jones and other members of the Committee on Public Safety, my name is Danielle Outlaw, and I am the Police Commissioner for the City of Philadelphia. Along with me on the call today is Staff Inspector Fran Healy for any additional questions that you all may have in the event that I have to hop off or if I need to defer. I would like to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to voice the police department's position regarding proposed bill number 200368, which creates a new section, 10-2500 of the Philadelphia Code. As you are all aware, to improve transparency, the Philadelphia Police Department now posts all police directives online for the public to inspect. Directive 10.2, use of moderate, limited force, addresses the general use of force and specifically prohibits, whenever possible, sitting, kneeling, or standing on a subject's back or chest and standing on a subject's head, face, and or neck area. This directive also prohibits neck restraints such as choke holds and sleeper holds. The impetus for proposed bill 200368 came about upon a review of our policy by Councilman Johnson, during which he identified an area that needed clarification. He specifically identified that our policy prohibited kneeling on a subject's back, but it did not expressly prohibit kneeling on a subject's neck. Our use of force policies have been reviewed and critiqued by the Department of Justice, and this oversight was not identified. This is the very reason why I support public posting of departmental policies. People with different backgrounds and perspectives can read policies differently. To achieve organizational excellence, the Philadelphia Police Department must be willing to listen and respect individuals with different backgrounds and perspectives that provide valuable feedback. As such, I support proposed Bill 200368. This is not necessarily a change in departmental policy, but rather a necessary clarification. Accordingly, I will be amending Directive 10.2 as soon as possible to incorporate this clarification. In closing, I'd like to thank Councilman Johnson for his proposed bill, but also his willingness to work with and discuss this issue with my office prior to today's hearing. Collaboration is key in this. So I truly appreciate the councilman reaching out in advance to discuss an ordinance that directly affects police policy. This concludes my testimony, and we are available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. A quick question before I yield the mic to my colleague who brought this bill. In your training at the academy, is there a technique that you use for sleeper holds? This kind of is there a proportionality as to the use of force and how it gradually may escalate if brought to a issue? My first question: is there a chokehold taught at the academy?
So we do not train on sleeper holds. The answer to your question. And to follow up, it's also important to make sure that we're not just pushing out policy, but we're actually testing what we're training as well. And that is also included, de-escalation as such, is also included in our reality-based training as well.
Okay, Member Johnson?
Mr. Chairman, you actually already asked my question, and so I just wanted to take a moment to just thank Commissioner Daniel Outlaw for her having an open mind and working in collaboration and partnership with my staff. I want to take also a moment to acknowledge Fran Healy, who I've worked with in the past on a variety of pieces of legislation, also for his input. So, Commissioner, just wanted to thank you for taking a progressive approach and having an open mind regarding police reforms. And just want to personally just acknowledge you for your hard work and your dedication. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Johnson. Ms. Williams, is there any members that wish to ask questions?
Council Member Ginn?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I also want to acknowledge the bill sponsor again for this important piece of legislation, and I want to thank the Commissioner for your partnership and support in making sure that this is a policy that is not only bold and important, but also works and is clearly communicated to all of your members of your force. So thank you very much to everybody, and I will be proud to be voting in favor of it. I also wanted just to ask, because I know this is happening as we speak, but there is a protest that is going on right now in MSB. A reporter was arrested, and I was just wondering if you're aware of that and what communications have been shared about how to handle peaceful protests in this moment.
I am aware of it. Actually, I've been sitting in this session since 2:00, so I've only been able to relay or actually receive information from the field. But yes, I am aware, and I'm also aware that she was immediately released, and the additional details I'm looking forward to hear from those who are actually there and on ground. I will also say that after May 30th, I immediately put out information as to how media are to be addressed when they're recognized as media. And, I've said before that we also need, when asked, folks to display their credentials or when asked for identification. So thank you for asking the question. I am aware. And like I said, given that I've been in this meeting since 2:00, I don't know all the full details.
And the police department's policy on reporters is that they should not be put under arrest when covering a particular as part of their work. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, is that they should not be what? You broke up.
They should not be placed under arrest. They should not be, I don't know. They should not be, can we agree they should not be placed under arrest, and how why is this not clearly communicated, including a police officer who said very openly, put this on Twitter when he was arresting her?
Yeah, again, I don't have the full details, but when a reporter is working within, the course of their duties, absolutely, we do expect that anyone down there on scene to communicate with them. And if the current location is not an ideal place for that reporter to be, that they are able to move to a location that is safe and they're able to report as well. Again, I don't know the entire story there. All I'm aware of is what was alleged by the reporter impacted.
The current bill before us prohibits a use of police force that is particularly detrimental to the physical safety of individuals, and I think we all recognize that very clearly. But it's also an important opportunity to look at other policies and methods that can be used by the police department. Recently, as you know, tear gas and rubber bullets have been used to disperse crowds. What are the elements of, say, non-lethal use of forces that are at the disposal of the police department?
So there's actually a few things, and I appreciate you saying that, because we are actually currently reviewing all of our munitions that are available to us, and then also how that information, or how once those munitions are deployed, how they should be reported. And I would even say, I would take it a step further to say, not just with less lethal munitions, but I am also making sure that we look into how a pointing of a firearm at someone is reported. Because right now I don't believe it's reportable use of force, and I think it should be. I also believe that, and our policy very clearly states that there has to be a threat to life or someone else's life in order to utilize these munitions. And our policy, again, is very clear around when to use them. However, I am not a fan of utilizing munitions that are not specifically designed to be used toward an individual, meaning direct impact. My preference would be direct impact because there's a larger chance for munitions to be used indiscriminately in crowds when used in crowd situations. So there's a wide range of things that we are currently reviewing right now, and want to make sure that we do also get the proper input before we make a final decision on what we continue to use, or if we continue to use things with certain restrictions or things that we get rid of altogether.
In the interest of time, would you be able to share with the council chair the actual list of actions, non-lethal actions that the PPD is allowed to employ, and what you are actually reviewing?
Yeah, I can forward the whole list. I mean, it's more than just one thing. There's several things, and I'd be happy to forward that to you all later.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And what, are you able to also just give us a little bit about what your priorities are for a policing contract that is also fair for communities and your staff?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing is, making sure, so this current contract was negotiated prior to my arrival. Also understanding that there's a clear need for community input because some of the previous witnesses were absolutely correct in stating that, and I'm paraphrasing, that we receive our authority from the community. We work for the people. We are of the people, and we work for the people. So there has to be community input. What that looks like, I understand that's yet to be determined, but I agree that there has to be input there. A huge sticking point for any police leader, but specifically myself, since I'm in this role now, is making sure that the contract very clearly defines what's management rights versus anything that's subject to collective bargaining. Currently, right now, I hear that there's a large need and request and desire publicly, and I would even quite frankly say internally, to be able to rotate people out of certain assignments, whether it's to prevent burnout or to ensure diversity among certain units, or even just to be able to eliminate toxic environments where they exist. Right now, I don't have the ability to do that. I don't have the ability to transfer or rotate people out of assignments because of limitations of the contract. There's a very few small number of individuals and units where I can do that. So that's priority. And then also for me is making sure that there's consistency in our accountability mechanisms. Right now, we don't have that. We do have a discipline code. I want to make sure that the discipline code aligns with our processes, with our discipline processes. And right now, as you've heard from previous testimony, whether it's PBI or components of internal investigations and how that works, doesn't necessarily produce a consistent outcome. So I want us to be able to say if someone was sustained for a certain allegation, that previous discipline is not only consistent, but it's proportional. So I would say my top priorities would be including management rights, making sure that we have the ability to strengthen our accountability mechanisms, and then lastly, the arbitration piece is key for us. And if and when the arbitrator agrees with the police commissioner's findings of sustained, that they don't have the ability to split the baby or to lessen any discipline that's imposed. So those would be my top three.
Yeah. And then my last question, and thank you so much, Commissioner Outlaw, for your patience, is that, there's been a lot of discussion about the funding of the department. And do you have thoughts about how you can work with City Council about greater transparency, about your budget? Obviously this was a challenging time for us being in virtual mode and not being able to have a more personal engagement and interaction with you. And so, we generally have like a session where we can ask questions on the record, but I think it helps to also have some thoughts about how to work better on transparency, to help cut costs, maybe to use Councilmember Gilmore Richardson's bill to be supportive on all of that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, to your point, I think this budget process was completely, it was unprecedented and it was expedited. And, while everything that we put forth was in fact made public, but the only, I don't think we were able to hash everything out in the 2.5 hours of questioning that I got. And it would be helpful to have several working sessions leading up to that. With that said, I do believe that there are plenty of services out there that need adequate funding because, as I've said before, the police department does not have any control over the social determinants that drive crime. And usually we're brought in on the back end as a reactionary force to try to do something about it, or we're working against other, and it's not intentional, it's just the way the systems are set up. We do our best to work in collaboration with social services. But again, whenever you call the police, it automatically criminalizes whatever it is that we're dealing with. So I think there has to be a very candid conversation and dialogue around what public safety looks like, what the police department actually responds to, and whether or not that funding actually can come from the police department. We don't really truly know the answer to that, because we know that a large percentage of our budget is us. But with that said, ultimately, what I hear people saying is, well, if we put the funding where it needs to be in social services, we won't have the need to have as many police officers as we currently have. We don't know the answer to that right now. So I don't think we jump into something and throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there absolutely has to be urgent and meaningful dialogue around how the police are used, what we respond to, and who we collaborate with, whose role is what as it relates to a lot of these societal issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Commissioner Outlaw.
Thank you, Member Gim. Samantha Williams, who's next?
Councilmember Gautier.
Member Gautier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, the bill we're considering prohibits officers from using techniques that present a substantial risk of asphyxiation unless necessary to prevent serious injury to an officer or member of the public. how would you instruct your officers on how to determine whether one of the maneuvers prohibited by the bill is necessary to prevent serious injury to an officer or member of the public? And how would your department define serious injury? I think you're on mute.
I said a whole bunch of stuff too. Thank you for your question. As I previously stated, our policy already prohibits a lot of those things, but it's to, again, not just push out policy, but we have to train according to the policy and then go back and test it. And then that's making sure that we are actually doing it, right? This is scenario-based training. So it's really different when you sit in a classroom and you say, okay, the policy says you cannot do A, B, and C, and then you take a written test. If you are not put in those scenarios, inducing the similar type of stress, and then in the end debriefing and say, okay, now tell me what happened, it's the point of putting these types of policies out. So that's the type of training that has to go along with the change or the clarification that was made for this one. Another thing that I want to go back and, you asked, well, what's considered serious? And I might have heard you say, how do we deem whether or not something is necessary? We know that the law doesn't allow for hindsight, right? So it's really what the officer is experiencing at that time. According to the policy, how can they articulate what the imminent threat was to themselves or others? Are all the gram factors met? That's up for them to decide, but we give them examples of, what that could look like. But there is no long list of, here's what serious injury is. If an officer believes that they're in fear for their life, they have to be able to articulate that. And then in the end, it has to make sense. The other piece is, again, how is it reported and investigated? That's another key piece of it. So if something is deemed necessary, if it was otherwise prohibited, are you investigating that as lethal force? And I think the answer to that would be yes.
Can I give you a scenario?
You can give me a scenario, but again, I don't really work in the world, in the world of hypotheticals because hindsight perfect.
Okay, well, try to speak to this one. Imagine that officers are arresting a person suspected of committing a minor economic offense like selling loose cigarettes. The suspect is larger and stronger than the arresting officer. And so during the attempted arrest, officers perceive that the suspect is resisting and fear that a fight will break out. In the moment, the officers fear that they will suffer serious injury if a fight breaks out due to the size and strength of the suspect. Can the officers employ a maneuver prohibited by this bill to prevent such a fight in order to avoid serious injury to themselves? And does the answer change if the maneuver is employed once a fight has broken out?
So this is a conversation. This is a conversation around, well, why are they even, going hands-on for selling loose cigarettes in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So and that's why I say hypotheticals don't necessarily work well, because with a lot of situations that might have been deemed legal in the past, there are you can find any expert that might come out and say, yeah, but I would have handled it differently. Was there even a need to do that in the first place? And depending on who you ask, that's the answer you would get. So my answer would be, well, why would they even be going hands-on or having a fight or engaging in a fight for somebody that's selling loose cigarettes? What's the point of that, right? So I think what you're getting at, that's the other piece that has to be reinforced through training. It's the whole conversation. Just because ultimately you get in a fight with someone and you're in fear for your life, does that mean that you should have gone hands-on in the first place? And I think that's where we lack, and we need to make sure that we pay most attention to as we are also rolling out the de-escalation pieces. You don't start, when you talk about de-escalation, right, you don't start up here when something is down here.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think also what I'm getting at is I support this bill, but I do think that it will be stronger if we're able to define more around what serious injury looks like. I think it's dangerous for that to be nebulous.
Well, there's a lot of case law around that. So I think, this conversation is a lot bigger than me sitting in this chair. This is case law that's all over the country. But there are some clear examples, some more obvious than others, as to what serious injury is.
Okay, I mean, we have some of the brightest minds in legal, so hopefully we can add some clarity there. And that's it for my question.
Thank you, member. Ms. Williams, who do we have next?
Councilmember Thomas.
Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Councilman Johnson for his leadership on this legislation. I am a proud co-sponsor of this legislation. Commissioner Outlaw, thank you and your team for taking the time to be here with us today to talk about this important matter. I just want, for clarity purposes, if the legislation is adopted and enacted into law, and after the legislation is enacted into law, if an officer were to still commit this violation, can you communicate to the public for their perspective and for clarity and for the record what consequences you yourself and the department would specifically be able to enforce if they were to break this violation after the legislation were to be enacted? And Mr. Chairman, that's my only question. I can imagine the time that constraints that folks are under. And I want to thank everybody for their willingness to continue to work on this issue, as it's important that we continue to have a conversation if we're going to be serious about changing how our communities are policed. So thank you.
Thank you, Member Thomas.
Councilmember Green.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Can we get just a quick answer for clarity purposes before Councilmember Green goes? I'm sorry, Councilmember Green.
No, that's appropriate.
Yeah. So, like I said, it would still be investigated as a lethal use of force. And depending on whatever the investigation gleans, if we found that it's an out of compliance use of force and is deemed unnecessary, I have the ability to use something called the suspension for 30 days with the intent to dismiss. And then we can also look at any other mitigating or aggravating factors. So I think what the public should know is that even, sometimes we think, oh, you can fire them right away. I cannot do that, given the current contractual parameters. But I do have, like I said, to suspend with the intent to dismiss.
Thank you.
And I may or may not have to hop off and turn it over.
Member Crane.
Right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be very brief with my question. Commissioner Outlaw, thank you for your service and thank you for the policy change and providing those policies online to provide much more transparency for the public. I want to thank my colleague, Councilmember Johnson, for this legislation. I'm proud to co-sponsor this. But I guess one of the questions I would like to ask, and you somewhat opened the door in this, your response to some of the other members of the council and talking about what can be considered serious bodily injury and also the perception that an officer may have, she or he may have a threat to their life. And we give our police officers a level of discretion as they're doing their jobs, but that discretion is also based on their own personal perspectives as well as training. And I know you being a police commissioner, but also African-American female, myself being a former assistant district attorney, but also someone who was also racially profiled once when leaving the DA's office and stopped by the police department. So the challenge and the dichotomy that I think is a challenge for, especially for African Americans who are in law enforcement, is that how we approach certain situations, even with certain training, what we consider as the possibility of being seriously injured may be different than others. So you talked about your training you'll be going to and how you're going to be doing training based on certain scenarios. But can you just kind of speak on that issue? Because I think that's really the crux of a lot of the concerns, is that people from different perspectives, even with training, have a different perception of serious bodily injury. As a prosecutor, you could take a pen and that can be used as serious bodily injury to an individual. So could you give a little perspective on how you're going to try to deal with this type of training going forward, considering the complexities of discretion we give to police officers and our own lens that we have when we come through life as individuals?
Yeah, and that will forever be I think that we all have to continue to address and grab the bull by the horns around that, which is why implicit bias training is so important. And I say all the time, My perspective is completely different than a lot of my colleagues. I understand that. And because of that, that's why we have to be willing to have the very difficult conversations and get folks to acknowledge that, hey, you might come to this job with some opinions or even fear that some of us might not have. And you're absolutely right. And that's why, we're seeking to roll out our implicit bias training in September. But to your point, training only does so much. As someone to be able to, again, make sure we call balls and strikes. Do things because they're afraid. If it's not a policy or if it's not something that we train to do, then it has to be addressed and be very consistent. And I think, been some areas where we haven't done so well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Graham. Are there any other questions for the Commissioner?
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Member Richardson.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say thank you to our commissioner for her testimony on Councilmember Johnson's legislation, and also thank her for clarifying the parameters around the current contractual issues around suspensions with the intent to dismiss. But I also wanted to say for the record, Mr. Chairman, that we all have to recognize that the commissioner hasn't even been here for 6 months. Okay, and we have to allow her the opportunity to do her job. So I just wanted to say for the record that I support Commissioner Outlaw in her role, and we need to give her an opportunity to do her job. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Richardson. And I concur. It seems like 6 months. Seems like 6 years. Worth of that.
It hasn't been 6 months yet. It's 4.
All right. Ms. Williams, do we have anyone else to ask questions?
No, we can move on to the next two witnesses, which are Sheriff Rochelle Bilal and Chief Nistel.
Thank you again, Commissioner, for your time.
Thank you. I'll hop off and leave you with Staff Inspector Healy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is the Sheriff? Is the Sheriff still connected? Sheriff Bilal? I don't hear her, so who's the next witness? We'll come back to her if she connects. Sam?
Chief Nistel, you can begin your testimony.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, members of City Council. I'm honored to join Commissioner Outlaw and Sheriff Bilal in commenting on Bill number 200368. My name is Tom Nistel. I'm the Chief of SEPTA's Transit Police. In these fiery times when demands for change in policing are on the lips of many, I'm invigorated by the potential that this opportunity can provide. People are afraid, angry, focused, and determined. The resulting change is not the soft, gentle rising of the tide. It's the wild and powerful slamming of a tidal wave, and it should be. We in policing have work to do in opening our doors and building organizations that are focused on helping and not offending. It's truly a sad state of affairs when legislation is needed to prevent the police from kneeling on a human being's head, neck, or face. The police should be the premier agency responsible for protecting constitutional rights and acting in a manner that is rooted in dignity and respect. I fully support the bill as submitted and commit to working with council and my law enforcement partners in developing a model for policing that embraces people and stops strangling them. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony, and I appreciate your long history in Philadelphia in law enforcement. And Ms. Williams, is there anyone asking questions?
I do not see any members who wish to be recognized for questions.
Mr. Chair.
Member Johnson.
I just want to thank Commissioner Nestle for Your hard work and your dedication as chairman of Transportation and Public Utilities, just having the opportunity to work with you in the past. And so I just want to say I respect your leadership and thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Councilman, and it's been a pleasure to work with you and your office.
I want to focus also during the pandemic, you had a difficult time of dealing with the ridership and many of the challenges from the airport to overnight rides on SEPTA vehicles, and you dealt with them with proportionality. And we noticed it and we appreciate it. It did not go unnoticed.
Thank you, Councilman. I know that everybody in the city had their hands full.
All right. Did we find the sheriff, Ms. Williams?
I believe she is no longer connected with us.
All right.
So
Thank you for
we'll need
your
to move on to the
testimony.
next case.
Who is the next witness to testify, Ms. Williams?
John Coyle, Harold James, and Stephanie Purnell.
Thank you all for your patience. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Good afternoon, members of the Standing Committee on Public Safety. My name is John Coyle. I'm an attorney with McElder Young, and along with my colleagues Lee Merritt, Mark McGuire, and Dan Pertel, I represent families of the victims of a deadly policing culture. Many of my clients you know, like George Floyd, Tatiana Jefferson, Ahmaud Arbery, and Botham Jean. Far too many you don't. My clients come from across the nation, but the systems and cultures that precipitated their deaths are the same, reflective of a pervasive crisis impacting us all, and one abundantly evident here in our own city. George Floyd's pleas for air were ignored as life slowly left his body. Tatiana Jefferson was gunned down by police in her Fort Worth bedroom while playing video games with her nephew. Botham Jean was murdered by police for watching television in his own apartment. Michael Dean was shot in the head during a routine traffic stop while getting milk from the grocery store. Jamel Roberson was shot in the back by police as he approached an active gunman attempting to shoot up a Chicago area nightclub. Everett Palmer was killed by prison guards after voluntarily turning himself in for a DUI arrest. Jeffrey Dennis was shot 3 times in the side of the head by Philadelphia police officer Richard Nicoletti as he sat unarmed in his car. The second unarmed man that Officer Nicoletti has shot, and yet he still holds a badge. The senseless and needless deaths are seemingly endless, a river of blood fueled by a reservoir of violence from unaccountable and insufficiently trained law enforcement officers. To many, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by a group of racists in Georgia and the subsequent efforts to cover up the murder by local law enforcement seem a lurid tale from a bygone time. It is not. It's modern-day America and reflects a persistent culture in law enforcement that holds their own to a lesser standard, and in doing so fails to respect America's fundamental guarantee of equality for all human life. This crisis has been permitted to fester by a greater cultural disregard for human dignity, a culture born of many factors but thriving on the persistent war on drugs and dehumanizing of those struggling with addiction or the relentless grip of poverty. The us against them attitude engendered by these cultural traits has given rise to the most incarcerated society in world history and the bloodiest police culture in the modern world, a reality incompatible with freedom, liberty, and equality for all. Today's bill is an important first step, and I commend this committee for moving quickly to mitigate the unnecessarily dangerous use of chokeholds and kneeling on faces and throats. However, I implore you to go much further. Prerequisite to true change is a searching inventory of our own processes and an unwavering commitment to follow through. Accountability, redressability, and transparency must be the pillars of any path forward. Empathy and compassion must permeate our law enforcement structures. You must consider administrative and criminal processes for the review of police misconduct. Plans that ensure violent offenders are not allowed to continue to wield the power of the state need to be discussed. Mechanisms for review and oversight outside the police apparatus have to be developed. And barriers to accountability, like the police discipline arbitration process, must be removed. We welcome the opportunity for our Philadelphia clients to tell you their stories and for us to discuss policies and strategies for action with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Hearing none, who are the next witnesses to testify? And thank you again for bringing this to our attention.
Councilmember Thomas had a question.
Member Thomas.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coyle, I first wanted to just say thank you and acknowledge the great work that your firm is doing all across the country. You talked about a specific scenario here in the Philadelphia region. Can you elaborate more on that scenario? You mentioned the officer and the shooting. Can you provide more information about that?
We actually have two cases right now in the Philadelphia area. One is Jeffrey Dennis. A narcotics field unit team was in plain clothes and was attempting to serve a warrant at his house and decided to, as he drove by, pursue his car and make a car stop. As they jumped out, they were not wearing any. It was very similar to the Philip Holland case in that they weren't wearing any identifying clothing of any kind. Mr. Dennis tried to back away and maneuver his car away from the stop, at which time his car was rammed, and Officer Nicoletti, after the car was rammed and stopped, discharged his firearm 3 times into the side of the car, killing Mr. Dennis. That was a case where Mr. Dennis was unarmed at the time, had no weapon on him, and was sitting in his vehicle and posed no threat to anyone. Officer Nicoletti was previously disciplined for the exact same conduct, shooting into a car during a traffic stop. He and the members of his team were disciplined for this incident, but he was not terminated. He was allowed to keep his badge. And that's an outcome that seems incompatible with the demands of our populace and what we're seeing in the streets here today. Someone who takes the lives of an individual who's unarmed and posing no threat, and who has previously used potentially fatal force on another unarmed man does not deserve a badge and does not deserve to represent the citizens of Philadelphia.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In that first situation, I actually vividly remember I was not on city council yet, and I was in a group with folks who actually knew him. And we put ourselves in that same situation, and we could understand from a hypothetical perspective without the actual audio, just the video, how somebody could possibly be confused as to whether or not it was a traffic stop or if it was something going on. So I do remember that. I appreciate that. Last question. And again, just really appreciate the work that you're doing all across the country and the advocacy that's happening. It's very important that we raise awareness around these cases. When you're involved in these situations, just on average, how much does this cost municipalities? I know one of the things that we're focused on here in the city of Philadelphia is looking at things through a very tight fiscal lens and trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible. And this is one of the areas that I view as waste and as a way that we could begin to maybe have some savings.
One of the tools we utilize in trying to value these cases, and it's very difficult to put a value on human life in any coherent way. One of the tools we utilize is sort of a national database of settlements or trial verdicts that we've developed. And in the most extreme cases, like the woman who was killed in Minnesota, settlements can run up to $20 million. The cases, some of the clients we represent, Tatiana Jefferson and Michael Dean and Jamel Roberson, are cases that we anticipate resolving well into the 8-figure range. In other cases that are a little more difficult, or cases against smaller municipalities, their financial status plays a role in those settlements. The Antoine Rose case was against a municipality that only had, I believe, 9,000 citizens, and that case settled for $2 million and resulted in their police department being disbanded. So the reality is that one of these cases can have a major financial impact. And one of the things that we have to consider here is it is Marcel Pratt that stands in front of you and has to explain why so much money is going out the door. It sort of takes the responsibility for those settlements away from the police department and puts it at the doorstep of the city solicitor, who neither created nor can rectify those problems. Tying that settlement money back to the police department is something that perhaps council should consider in creating greater accountability in these types of cases and resolving cases of excessive force or false arrest.
Mr. Coyle, again, thank you for your important testimony. Thank you for the work that you're doing across the country. I know, just as a young black man born and raised in the city of Philadelphia who has had multiple negative encounters with police officers, I can assure you that I appreciate it, and I know that there are many others out there that do as well. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Member Thomas. Ms. Williams, is there anyone else?
I have a quick question, Mr. Chair.
Member Johnson.
Yes, John, how you doing? I hope all is well. I want to thank you for taking time, my friend, out of your schedule for testifying on this panel. You talked briefly about something that's very, very interesting regarding the settlements that municipalities enter in as a result of police misconduct. And so can you just give us a brief idea regarding your experience working with the law department and that role of the City of Philadelphia Solicitor Department defending police officers? Give us the inside view of what that looks like. And I'm glad you talked about if we could tie the settlements into impacting actually the budget of the Philadelphia Police Department. I think behavior would change immediately, because when we recognize that when people take a financial loss, behavior changes significantly. And can you just elaborate on your experience on that aspect, being on the other side?
Sure. What Councilman Johnson is referring to, before I entered private practice, I spent 5 years with the city solicitor's office, working primarily in civil rights cases. In my time in that office, when Craig Straw was running the group, the cases that came in that were very obviously problematic uses of force, cases where the force wasn't justified or was excessive, we would endeavor to settle those cases as quickly as possible for the lowest amount we could. The problem with that is that those numbers and those settlements were generally silent from any follow-up with the police department. There wasn't any repercussions on an officer if his shooting cost the city $2 million. There was no follow-up with the police department if a excessive use of the taser cost the city $250,000. That group does a very good job of vigorously defending cases that are not meritorious, and I think they attempt to resolve the ones that are. And even when they are planning on resolving, they'll still put up a good fight most of the way. But I think there's a sort of incentives issue at play there, where the police department doesn't have any skin in the game, so to speak, as it comes to the settlements being paid out by the solicitor's office.
Thank you very much, John. That's an excellent explanation, and thank you again for your testimony.
My pleasure, Councilman.
Thank you for your testimony. That was insightful. And I hope you. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions?
Councilmember Gim?
Member Gim?
Yes, I'm just unlocking my work. Thank you so much, Mr. Coyle, for those comments. We've been asking, one of the reasons why Councilmember Johnson's bill is so important to us right now is exactly because of what you said, that the amount of money and the litigation that has been paid out by the city of Philadelphia, has been significant. According to the legal intelligencer, Philadelphia has paid out nearly $40 million on malicious prosecution, false arrest, false imprisonment, overturned conviction claims between 2010 and 2019, which is obviously very serious to us. And I think one of the things that we want to be clear about is that is not only a danger, this is most importantly a danger to human life, but it has massive repercussions on many different levels. I mean, in your experience, do you think, we all are in concert in believing that the banning of these chokeholds and things that limit police use of force that are particularly dangerous are really important, but are there other things that you think really need to be partnered with this bill in order to ensure that the city is protected and that our officers are well trained and that the public safety is upheld?
I guess there's a couple parts to that. One, in terms of the city's protection, I don't know if any bill is going to save the city in that regard. Under current federal precedent, if there is an existing custom, policy, or practice of the municipality that can be held to be the moving force behind the constitutional violation, the city's on the hook. What that means practically is that if there are officers out there who are consistently engaging in excessive force and then finally end up shooting someone and the police department hasn't been properly disciplining them or terminating their employment along the way, the city is going to be responsible for that at the end of the day. And what we've seen, we're doing a lot of work with the Senate right now about some proposed legislation coming from both sides. We're seeing a push that perhaps even that doctrine may give way to straight respondeat superior or employer liability for the conduct of police officers. And if that's the case, then the city's going to be on the hook no matter what is banned by this body. I think if council really wants to make an impact here, it has to dive into the disciplinary processes of the police department, the processes that review discipline and the arbitration process. And council also has to really make a push to get a police department that is in touch with the communities that it polices. Right now, many of the officers live in an enclave in Northeast Philadelphia or live outside the city and have no emotional or neighborly connection to those people that they're serving. And I think that is part of the issue when I talk about dehumanizing people and their struggles and poverty and addiction. I think that if you could get people from the communities that they're serving, you may be able to start breaking down those barriers a little bit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Member Gim. Ms. Williams?
The next person to testify will be Harold James.
Former Representative James, are you there? Representative James, former rep, are you there? Who's the next witness?
Stephanie Purnell.
Ms. Purnell, are you there? Ms. Purnell?
I see her in the meeting, but she is on mute. Ms. Purnell, can you unmute your...
I am, sir.
All right. Thank you for your patience.
Yes,
Please
I'm here.
Please begin your testimony. State your name.
Hello?
Okay, there's a delay.
All right. So, are you listening to it on TV or something? You need to cut the TV off.
Yes, and I'll probably need to, I'm going to mute my television as well because I'm starting to get feedback.
We're going there.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you so much for an opportunity to address this forum. My name is Stephanie Purnell. I'm a 26-year retired veteran of the Philadelphia Police Department. 16 of my years of service with the Philadelphia Police Department were spent as a detective. And I am also a past president of the National Organization of Black Women in Law Enforcement, Philadelphia chapter. As to my advocacy, my activism, I'm a lifelong resident of Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, born and raised. I have always been inspired to join the police department to be a change agent because I grew up in a police district that was virulent with police brutality and injustice inflicted upon minority and marginalized people. So I've spent and dedicated my career to advocating on behalf of my community and for justice and equality of treatment. As to the proposal of this bill, I want to thank you all, Council, for hearing us on this matter, as well as Councilman Kenyatta Johnson, who is sponsoring this bill. It is very important. It's a very important step to begin the process of police reform. And just to piggyback on what Mr. Mellon just recently said, it has to be a measure that has teeth, that holds officers accountable. I spent 26 years on the police department and never once did I have a police complaint lodged against me. I made just as many arrests as all of my other counterparts. I've worked in any number of units and assignments. I spent 10 years in patrol at the 39th District, 22nd and Hunting Park. So I know my neighborhood well, I know the city well, and I always handled my job as a law enforcement officer the way that I would want a law enforcement officer to interact with someone in my family. As much as we may come up with ways to legislate, there's no way to legislate a heart. It's impossible. What has to be done is that there has to be a bill in place that holds officers accountable. I'm brought back to memory of the late, great Willie L. Williams, the police commissioner who promoted me to detective. One of his favorite sayings, and I always held that to my heart, was that as it pertains to officers who were corrupt and bigoted and prejudiced or racist, it did not matter what you thought or what you believed, but you better be ready to be held accountable for your actions. That's something I live by. I'm proud to have served the city for as long as I did, and I look forward to seeing you all do whatever you can, and if there's any way I can be of assistance, I would love to be.
Thank you for your service, first and foremost, and making that statement of how long you served without any incident.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear you.
All right. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? For your service, first and foremost, and making that statement of how long you served without any incident.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear you.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Just again. Are there any questions for this?
Can you hear me now?
There are no questions for this witness. Is that Harold James that was just
Yes, this is Harold James.
Okay, please begin your testimony.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Harold James. I'm a retired Philadelphia police officer of 20, also a retired state rep of 20 years. And I just want to thank Councilman Johnson for sponsoring this bill and the other council members for supporting the bill. I think it's very important because it's very interesting that the fact that you got the branches of government working together to try to achieve a goal, because when I was in the police department, that didn't happen. We have the Guardian Civic League, in which I hope that you will be able to get Rochelle Bilal, the sheriff's testimony, who's been heading the Guardian Civic League for the past 10 or 15 years. But I think this is a great bill, and it goes a long way, and it's a pleasure and proud to be on the same testimony and panel as the police commissioner, who I think is doing a good job at this time. And I'm available for any questions.
I just want to thank you for your service. And I remember as a young man, you, Alfonso Deal, stepping up to the plate and showing young people that whenever you say all people are or all police are, it is not true, because they're always good examples.
Right. Well, that is true. I mean, I've served. I've been hit. A bullet hit me in the head one time. A ricochet hit me in the head. I got stabbed one time, and then I got shot. But never did I have to use excessive force on anyone.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from members?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair?
Yes. Go ahead, Member Johnson.
Yep. I just want to thank Stephanie Purnell for her testimony and her years of service as a Philadelphia police officer, as well as being a part of NOVA, which is a National Organization of Blacks in Law Enforcement. And also I want to thank the Honorable Harold James for his dedication. And for the most part, people may or may not know, because I know we have a lot of freshman members, but Harold James was on the front line early on when it came to addressing the issue of police brutality. I remember going on the scene with him as a young man when Dante Dawson was a young man that was shot by Philadelphia police officers while he was sitting inside the car up on Glenwood Avenue off of Broad and Glenwood, unarmed. And I remember your leadership serving with the Guardian Civic League, again, being on the front lines, fighting for African-American officers, fighting for change, and making sure when it comes to the issue of police brutality, that justice was served equally and fairly, regardless of a person's skin. And so, Representative Harold James, I want to thank you for your testimony, but also, most importantly, for your service and being on the front line and paving a way for a lot of black officers to be where they're at today in terms of ranks in the Philadelphia Police Department. So I just want to acknowledge that. And also, for the record, Chairman Jones, that Rochelle Bilal, our sheriff, although she had to step away because she got pulled into another meeting, she also wants to be on the record as supporting this bill as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Johnson.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Representative James.
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Williams.
There are no other questions and no other witnesses. So we could move into the public meeting if you are ready, sir.
Okay, we are going to give all of the witnesses a moment to disconnect as we transition from our hearing into our public meeting. So we're going to take a minute break while they disconnect. Since there are no other people to testify on these bills, we are now going to go into our public meeting. Ms. Williams, will you please read the roll? And will members just say a word or two so that your image appears on the screen?
Councilmember Johnson.
Here, present.
Councilmember Thomas.
Present.
Councilmember Green. We can see you, Councilmember, but we can't hear you. Councilmember Gautier?
Present.
Ms. Williams, Councilmember Green, present.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. Councilmember Ginn?
Present.
Councilmember Brooks?
Present.
And Councilmember Jones, that completes the roll call.
Thank you. We will now go into our public meeting. The chair recognizes Councilmember Johnson for a motion on amendments to bill number 200-364.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer an amendment to bill number 200364. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to bill number 200364 be approved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that the amendments to bill number 200364 be approved. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. The motion carries that the amendments to bill number 200364 has been approved. The chair again recognizes Councilman Johnson for a motion on the, wait a minute, there we go. The chair recognizes again Councilmember Johnson for a motion on bill number 200364 as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that bill number 200364 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
It has been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it, and the amendment has been approved. It has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 200364 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation. And further move that the rules of council be suspended to allow reading of this bill at our next session of council. That's right. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? The ayes have it. Chair again recognizes Councilman Johnson for a motion for the amendment to bill number 200368. Councilmember Johnson? Councilmember Johnson, have we lost you?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer an amendment to bill number 200368. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to bill number 200368 be approved.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that the amendment to bill number 200368 be approved. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. The chair again recognizes Councilman Johnson for a motion on bill number 200368 as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that bill number 200368 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 200368 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation. And further, that move that the rules of council be suspended to allow first reading at our next session of council. All those in favor would signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. All right, and so with that, this concludes the business of the Committee on Public Safety for today. I thank you all. I thank you all for your patience in this important legislation moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also,
Thank you.
thank all my colleagues for their affirmative vote, bringing the bill out of the committee. And I want to also thank my colleague, Councilwoman Kathleen Gilmore Richardson, as well, for her leadership and her bill today regarding police arbitration. Thank you very much.
Good piece of work, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations, Councilmember Johnson.
Congratulations.